Operation Barbarossa. Operation Barbarossa was the code name for the invasion of the Soviet Union by Nazi Germany and some of its Axis allies. During World War II. It started on June 22, 1941. It was the largest military invasion in human history, with more than 3 million men attacking along an 1,800-mile front. The code name was a tribute to Frederick I, a German king and Holy Roman Emperor who had led a crusade to the east in the 12th century.
Welcome, everybody, to the July 31st edition of our ongoing seminar on the Eastern Front in the Second World War. We're very happy today to have Professor David Stahel, who is a lecturer at the University of New South Wales in Canberra on history in general, European history, of course, but the Second World War. Now, those of you who are not familiar with David's work, David has done in the past 15 years amazing ensemble of work on the Eastern Front in World War II. This includes his book that we will be talking with him tonight about, his first book, Operation Barbarossa and Germany's Defeat in the East, but it was followed by a stream of one book after the next, dealing with the first 6 to 7 months of the German invasion of the Soviet Union. So he followed that with a book. These books were published by Cambridge University Press, Kiev, 1941. Then he dealt with the questions that most of us have been thinking about in this issue for decades: Nazi policy on the Eastern Front. That was a collection of edited papers that was published by the University of Rochester Press. Then he followed that with a book on Operation Typhoon, a book on the Battle for Moscow, and then in 2017 he did a book on the whole issue of the appeal of the anti-Bolshevik crusade to those in Europe who are aligned with fascism and National Socialism. He followed that with an edited collection of essays called Mass Violence in Nazi-Occupied Europe. And then he also did a collection with our close colleague, Craig Luther, Soldiers of Barbarossa, that was published by Stackpole. He came out with a very innovative, interesting interpretation of the retreat from Moscow. Must read. Farrar, Strauss, and Giroux did that. And finally, his most recent book is an examination of Hans Guderian, Hübner, Reinhardt, and Schmidt, Hitler's Panzer Generals. So it's a great pleasure to have him here today to talk to us about his first book on Operation Barbarossa. And without further ado, David, again, a great pleasure. Thank you so much for joining us today, and the show is yours.
Thank you very much. I wasn't sure what forum you guys were going to get, and so I put a picture of myself in there because I wasn't sure if it was just screens, but you've all seen me anyway. You now know how I look. I thought maybe to kick it off, I might just start sort of strategic, i.e., what's the main thing going on with this book? Yeah, you can read the title and say it's Operation Barbarossa, but actually this was a PhD, right? So there has to be a thesis. What's the thesis driving this thing? And the main aim of this book is to look at operational questions. You know, if we imagine there's strategic, there's operational, there's tactical. I was very interested in the operational, and why? Because it always struck me, and you have to understand that this book came out 15 years ago, but I'd been thinking about it for quite a few years before that. And I grew up on literature basically published in the 90s and everything before that. And so it always struck me that there was a bit of a disconnect between what I would read in books, the analysis that was given to Barbarossa, with what actually seemed to be happening on the ground. So I guess my starting contention for this book was, what is happening in that middle shift of the German army? It's a very big army. A lot of the books that I grew up reading were just giving you a big overview. They'd tell you what happened on the Eastern Front, but not any real detail. And so I was very interested in trying to marry how are operations contributing to the strategic goal. If the strategic goal is defeat the Soviet Union, destroy the Red Army, how is that happening at that Panzer Division, Panzer Corps level, where you're going to see a lot more of the war that is not typically represented, because just a lot of the literature that went before mine hadn't really bothered to spend a lot of time in those files. Sorry about the dog barking. That's the neighbor's dog. So not much I can do about that. So that's the first one there. Are we not getting any more? Where's my... Okay, here we are. We're still going. So this is an operationally themed military history, which will mean a lot to a lot of you. You guys are well aware of this sort of stuff. This whole presentation I've sort of made for this audience. I guess my assumption here is people know the big overview, and seeing some of the people who are already here, you guys know the broad brushstrokes. I'm not going to start with why did Hitler invade or anything. We're just going to go into it and look at this operational level campaign, because I think that's the level at which we really value add. Keep in mind, this is a 15-year-old thesis. We value add in terms of understanding the true success, and maybe even, as the title might suggest, the failings of Operation Barbarossa. I guess the way I put it there is we're all aware of those classic military indicators for what constitutes success. If you're advancing, you're succeeding. If you're destroying more enemy equipment, you're succeeding. And I think that's the level of analysis that a lot of authors were before mine, perhaps, very enamored by, right? Well, clearly the Germans are winning here. How could they not be? Have you not seen the scale of these victories? But the real question is, what are these victories? Clearly German victories, but what are they costing them? And to what extent do these operations add up to the fulfillment of the strategic goal? If that strategic goal is to defeat the Russians, you can tell me to the end of the earth about how many victories they achieve. It doesn't matter how many they achieve unless that's going to achieve their strategic goal, because there's no real contingency in German planning for anything other than a successful Barbarossa. And there's a lot of implications for Germany in terms of this war if they don't succeed in the summer of 41. So start with, I thought I'd go with a picture tells 1,000 words type map, which I think wonderful. Are you guys getting that one?
Yes.
Yeah. Which wonderfully sort of sets up the Eastern Front in a not just what we normally see. We normally see a whole bunch of like formations, but the folks who did the Germany in the Second World War collection, which is obviously this big sort of 10-volume, but many sub-volumes as well, collection in I think this is volume 4. Yeah, down the very bottom there, is it? No, it doesn't say which volume it is, but it's coming from the 20th of June, so it's before the invasion. And I think what this represents is important for understanding my book, because my book isn't as much as that title says, Operation Barbarossa. I'm certainly not dealing with Operation Barbarossa. And if you were on before when Jim and I were talking about, oh yeah, the nature of how these files work, you have to understand there's a phenomenal amount. I mean, it's expertise on the Eastern Front. True expertise requires you to spend, well, I met one guy who I would say definitely had true expertise, Felix Roemer, who decided to do the Commissar order. But in order to not do a case study, Felix Roemer moved to Freiburg, lived there for 2 years, because his plan was, I'm going to read it all in 1941. I said, what does that mean to read it all? He said, I'm going to read every file in order to quantify exactly what we can say about how many units implemented this Commissar order. Extraordinary. But that was a very proficient guy. And back in those days, the archive was open 8 in the morning till 6 at night. And I would use the whole time because I didn't live in Freiburg. And Felix was always there, which just gives you a snapshot of how long you would have to spend. He was a faster reader than I was because he's a real German. To read it all, just to read it all, not to say about writing anything. So it's massive, and I'm dealing with, so we've got our big map there. You can also see it's not even, right? If you get down to the Ukraine, you can start to see these little, collections of men and so on. It thins out very much, even though, you got 320,000 Romanians invading, and yet that doesn't look like that much. But in total, it's 3.2 million Germans. Oh, I'm putting up a few books here just by way of sort of, here's where the footnotes are. I want to be scholarly. So these maps do come from Germany in the Second World War. As I said, I also thought I'd add, and I'm glad I did now because I see that Rob's here. But if you are looking for collections on the Eastern Front, there's a wonderful and very accessible, because it's always a bit difficult to find certain maps in certain areas. So now what I've done is I've zoomed in, right? And basically my book, the one we'll be talking about today, is a relatively small part of this Eastern Front. In terms of frontage, Army Group Centre is by far the largest, but it's quite condensed. It's also overrepresented in terms of panzer forces. So there's 4 panzer groups on the Eastern Front. We'll be looking, and my book very much focuses on 2. Why did I do that? Because this is really where it's 2/3 basically of Germany's strength. So it's not that all the panzer groups are exactly equal in terms of numbers and strengths. Panzer Group 3 and Panzer Group 2 are about 1/3 stronger than the other 2. So they represent more than 50% of the armored strength. And I guess the other thing I would say, and we're going to see this as we sort of progress, I always think it's very helpful to explain Barbarossa to people as sort of 2 armies invading. There is an armored edge that moves very rapidly, and then there is this infantry base, and the fact that they move at 2 different strengths introduces operational problems. It also means that Germany's ability to win this war in the way that that strategic plan stipulates is heavily dependent on a minority of the German Ostheer. So if we break that down into numbers, there's 150 German divisions, but only 30 of which are motorized or panzer. And 2/3 of those are concentrated in Army Group Center. So my thinking going into this book, and again, this is a PhD, was if I very tightly focus on Panzer Group 3, Panzer Group 2, and read just about everything I can get my hands on in those, depending on where their success is and how we gauge that success, will provide a pretty good indicator of not just how this operation continues, but the kinds of prospects Germany has at the end of the period I'll be looking at, which is basically the first 2 months of operations. Where is Germany by the end of that? And how close are they to the fulfillment of this plan? I mean, there's various different dates that are set for what Barbarossa has to succeed by. You can find some that are very short. Brauchitsch at one point talks about 6 weeks. It gets up to, the maximum I found was about 10 weeks. So if that's our window to operate in, well, we're going to see how that goes in the course of our little presentation. So I put up a couple other books here because I was sort of getting into this. My professor, actually, I did my PhD. There's a wonderful title in German for that. In English, we just say, of course, your supervisor. I love the German for it. It's called Dr. Vater. So, my doctoral father, Rolf-Dieter Müller, he did some wonderful work looking at the pre-war planning. There's a few books that have done that, but his book really added a few extra things looking at sort of before just middle of 1940, when the planning for Barbarossa or the first discussions about it begin. He talks about Germany's view in this book going right back to sort of like when there's a Poland and them talking to Poland. There's Barry Leach's book from the 70s, which is old and in some ways dated and in some ways wonderfully still very rich. And then just because of all the War of Annihilation stuff, I refer you to a good mate of mine, Alex Kay. He did some wonderful work there. It's actually also his PhD. And actually, I met him at the Humboldt University when he was doing his, I was doing mine. It's amazing how some of those connections turn into sort of lifelong relationships. Okay, so this slide here, I've actually pulled this one out of my undergraduate lectures. And again, I think what I'm trying to give you here is, if you're well aware, and a lot of you will be, the field marshals there on the left-hand column, the key one for us is Feder von Bock. And so those are the big groupings that are invading the Soviet Union. But nominally, there should be, in where those lines, those arrows are going, there should be in there a good, 13 armies in Barbarossa. So these panzer groups aren't autonomous. They belong to armies, but there's too many guys to put in there. And it still makes that point, right? These are the guys on the right are the, I would say, most important commanders because they are the ones driving this thing forward. It very much depends, the mobility of the German army, on these men. Someone wrote in a book many, many years ago, and I thought it was a wonderful analogy. They talked about Barbarossa as being a spear and, the Ostheer as being a spear. The panzer groups are the spear tip, and that all those infantry divisions, the other sort of 120, become the shaft. So the backbone and the artillery and all the infantry and all that sort of stuff is very important. But if you break that spear tip off, the prospects for Barbarossa are imperiled. And I think that's a helpful way to look at it. So basically, and this loops very well again, if you've heard that first sort of discussion, the preliminary discussion that Jim and I were having, it turns out you're all very aware of David Glantz's work. And back in the day when I was an unknown graduate student, I had actually, we were just talking about this, I'd written to David Glantz, and his maps, of course, especially going back 20 years ago when I had this contact with him, these were all part of his privately published works, right? So I'd never seen these before, and I bought those privately published. I don't know if you guys are aware. He did all these privately published things, literally just like A3, I think it was, pages and all spiral bound and so on. And there's tons of them. And when I found out these existed, I sort of put in this huge order, this enormous, I think it was 2 boxes turned up. And some of these were in there. Wonderful maps. Some of them have been published in various publications subsequently, but they're a great way of understanding Barbarossa. So that's what we're basically going to use for this presentation. What are we getting here? This is clearly that map we saw before. This is that central area of the Eastern Front, and it's the 22nd of June, 1941. So you can see that German forces are crossing the border. The other thing I would say that I think comes across very well in an image like this is if you imagine that, I don't know if you guys can see my little cursor. Can you see my cursor?
Yep.
Is it maybe that's a pointer?
Yes.
Yeah, you can.
Yep, that's the point. Yep.
If you can imagine Panzer Group 3 is up in the north here and Panzer Group 2 is down in the south here. One of the points about the Soviet dispositions is they are already half encircled before this operation begins because there's this large bulge that protrudes into the German-Soviet front, which facilitates this opening stage. And you can already see where the deepest German advances are taking place. Those are very much those 2 panzer groups. They're highly concentrated. And the breakthrough is quite clear on the first day. There are areas that hold. You can see down here at the bottom, Brest. So the great sort of fortress town, that's going to hold out. In fact, that's going to hold out for quite a while, but pretty much everything else crosses the border. The other thing I would say is, Germany, this huge army, it's not as though the army, however this may look to all of you, it's not as though that German army, if we think about the Fourth Army and the Second Army, the Ninth Army, they're all not crossing the border on the first day. It takes time for these infantry divisions, and that's because of the bottleneck of all this, of the infrastructure in Belarus. It's extremely poor, and the roads are very sandy, so it takes time to get in there, and the Panzer forces in their respective areas are very much prioritized. The other thing about the initial period, and you're about to see, I've got a literature there, and I see again I've got Craig on. The literature represents this. You see a very mixed response in this early period. It's not as though it's an even-handed, it's kind of luck of the draw. Some Soviet forces react very effectively and resist. Others seem to just collapse. Overall, that's true of the Eastern Front. I think there's more resistance around Belarus, this area here, than perhaps down in the Ukraine or up in Army Group North. And then, of course, I just put in here because of, there is this literature. I think that's the other thing. You can get subsets of literature on Barbarossa, which are quite remarkable, but it speaks to, again, that scale, that enormity of this campaign.
Hey, David, excuse
Yeah,
me.
go ahead.
Would you entertain questions in progress here?
100%, go for it.
Okay. Hi, it's Rob Kirchable. So, would it be accurate to say these maps, they look like maybe Laga Ost for the Germans and David Glantz for the Soviets? Is that kind of what you did, or what do we got here?
Well, it's a bit harder for me to answer because these are Glantz's maps and they were made 20 years ago, and I don't know quite how he constructed them. But a good point you make there that needs to be said is the thing that struck me about these maps, and we are 20 years on from when I think these maps were made. I don't actually know when he's made, but I saw them 20 years ago. They were a bit of an epiphany for me. They were very much what I was seeing when I got into the files. It's hard for me to remember exactly when I had this sort of realization. But again, one of the things I have to say that I know when I first started, that's actually a good way to introduce this. When I first showed my whole PhD with these maps in it to Rolf Dieter Muller, a very accomplished military historian who had contributed to the 4th volume of the German forces, he was very complimentary, but one of the things he singled out were the maps. And the reason why he said it, he said, I realized when we did our volume, if you know that volume, so there's the volume, and then there was an attendant little spiral bound book of maps that came with it, right? Very detailed. But he was critical. He said, I realized when I saw these maps that we'd made a mistake. We had represented the front in classic military history terms, i.e., where are the Germans? Here they are at this town. Therefore, we draw a north-south map line. And he's right. That's where I had seen maps drawn as well about the Eastern Front, giving one the impression that's where the German army is. And what you will discover in the course of looking at maps like this, and the thing we'll be focused on, is that is not a true representation at all. It is only where the forward elements of the Germans are, and even that, it's kind of like an isolated, you can see it there, I'll use my little pointer again. There's only like islands of German forces surging out into the vast expanse, advancing on roads. That says nothing about them capturing the areas to the left and the right. So you really need a map like this to see two things, both where are the Germans really advancing? It's only in these sort of isolated silos, and that it's also got to be represented left to right in that we are already seeing that separation between panzer groups and the overwhelming bulk of the German army, which is marching at the speed of marching men and walking horses. That's key to where we're going with this. We're not quite there, but that's key to where we're going with this. So in this second map, we're now on the 22nd of June. And I wanted to try and illustrate some of the operational problems, which is very much what that PhD gets into. Again, a lot of what I thought was so rich was not what I was finding in anything to do with Helder's diary or the OKH diaries. Those guys are too far removed and they're getting the overall big picture stuff. The real detail, the part that I found really changed what I was reading about Barbarossa, but fit with this thesis of, oh, there are very real operational problems. Those were coming out of divisional diaries, those were coming out of corps diaries, and sometimes the Panzer Group diaries themselves. So the diary of the 20th Panzer Division, which is up here in Panzer Group 3, you can see it there. It's making a note on this date that the enemy is offering tenacious resistance from modern concrete positions. Our losses are noticeable. This is 5 days in. This is very much the heyday of Barbarossa, right? This is the barnstorming ahead. These guys are still noting this is costly. And I think that the best illustration of that is the neighboring unit, the 7th Panzer Division. I don't mind saying this is one of the things I read in those files way back in the day, and I'll never forget reading it. I reread it thinking, could that be correct? Did I just read that? By the evening of the 28th of June, overall losses for the 7th Panzer Division constituted a hefty 50% of Mark II and Mark III tanks. This is the backbone of that division. They also do have some Mark IV tanks. They had suffered 75% losses. Now, I think the thing you have to understand, and what was very helpful in some of the diaries, I'm not sure if this is the one that broke it down for me, but losses have got two categories in the German diaries. There is Totalausfall, so that means total losses, i.e. someone's destroyed it, right? This is Soviet action. But there's another category, nicht einsatzfähig, so not operational. Now, in 5 days, they have lost 50% and 75% of the tanks, so that's at least 50%, or I'm not exactly sure off the top of my head. I think I broke it down in the book of the makeup, exactly how many of which type of tank makes up the 7th Panzer Division. It's got 299 tanks in that division. I remember that. It's the biggest in numerical terms on the Eastern Front. So it's not an exception, and it's not driving around with a whole bunch of Czech tanks or something which you might say, well, are they really the best? These, when you've got Mark IIIs and Mark IVs, less so the Mark II, but these are very good tanks. The problem is just simply motion. Driving over those Soviet roads, they're not roads as we perhaps classically understand them. You may have already seen photos of them. They're extremely dusty. That's one problem. That dust gets into the engines. And what does that mean? I mean, these are 1930s air filters. They're designed for very different conditions. They get overwhelmed very quickly. One of the things I also noted in reading a lot of these things was a very significant spike in oil. And I started to think, why are they all commenting on oil, as though you must know how these tanks go, but they're all talking about huge usage in a way that they weren't typically familiar with. And what they are doing is getting so much dust going through the air filters and getting in, therefore, to the engine, that they're trying to clean the engines out by just putting in lots more oil and trying to clean the engine out. Of course, that will not work, but it will give you a bit of a clean. But this is very provisional. The longer you keep driving on these roads, the more that sand and dust in your engine will just seize the engine up. And that's not yet the story. I'm probably getting a little bit ahead of myself, but it is the phenomena. And clearly we see that with 7th Panzer Division, that this is having a very real effect on Panzer numbers, and that will go on week in, week out to compromise their mobility in a way that has really nothing to do with the Soviet army. The Soviet army is a factor, but not as important as just motion. So we've got a real problem there. The impact on the 7th Panzer Division is so great that after relating these numbers, and the reason they relate them is because it says it can't achieve its objective, whatever its next objective is, without panzer forces being loaned to it by the neighboring 20th Panzer Division. This says a lot when we're 5 days into the campaign. A liaison officer from Panzer Group 3 visiting the 20th Panzer Division reports on this same day, the 22nd of June, of the enemy there exists the impression that his infantry is many times numerically superior and very good to the bitter end. Colonel von Bismarck used the expression fantastic. So again, we're seeing perhaps a varied result of Soviet forces, but the Soviet forces that are in this area are still resisting. It's not a one-sided battle. And the final thing that I've got here is actually from Goebbels. Goebbels' diary, you always do. I used to sort of think of Goebbels as, well, he's a party guy, he's in Berlin, and he's a propaganda minister. He's busy with his own agenda. One thing about Goebbels, he gets daily military reports. In fact, if you ever see his diaries, and by the way, his diaries come to 15 volumes or something. There's 2 sets. There's the pre-Barbarossa set, and then there's the sort of from 1941 set. And it's even that set. I've got them all downstairs. I can't actually remember, but it's 12, 15 or something, just to cover 1941 to 45. This man is incredibly well plugged in. So I started looking at his back then, and I've never gone back. I won't write a book on the Eastern Front without looking at Goebbels, because 2 things are true. He's extremely well plugged in on the military events. And here's the best part. Although he's Mr. Propaganda in anything you will read from him, that's not the case in his diary. There he is candid and honest. And he'll at times even have veiled criticism of Hitler, even though he is a sycophant, right? But he is very aware of how this war is going, and he seems to be very honest. On the 22nd of June, he writes in his diary, the first big pocket is beginning to close, but they are fighting very well, he means the Soviets, and have learned a great deal even since Sunday. He's concerned by this. In fact, it will only be a few weeks in, so still in the period of my first book. I don't actually have in my notes here any more from Goebbels. There's obviously a lot more in the book than I can squeeze into a presentation. But what he becomes concerned by is, on the one hand, we have this wonderful propaganda trumpeting all these successes, and on the bottom, on the other hand, he's commenting, I'm very concerned at our losses, and I'm very concerned that we are creating our own credibility gap between how much we're saying we're having success with we're going to have to deliver all this every day, this more and more success. We better actually succeed. He's clearly concerned about it. But that's perhaps a separate story. Okay, on the 22nd of June, now just looking a little bit on the other side of that front, we can start to see Panzer Group 2. Guderian's Panzer Group is down the bottom here. Guderian writes, I've got all these private letters from Guderian. So he writes on the 27th, early on the 22nd, the fighting started. This is writing to Margrethe, his wife. The fighting started in the same place where I finished in 1939. The first breakthrough occurred suddenly and had an annihilating effect. This was followed by several strenuous days on which we didn't have much food, sleep, and I found no time to write. It's clearly a dynamic campaign. Now, the other thing I'll just do before I move on to the next slide, I don't want to labor this too much, is we can already see something very interesting here if you've got a good eye for operational detail. Now, Hermann Hort in the north is doing what you would expect. They're going to close this thing on Minsk. You can see Minsk here where I'm circling here. Hort's got a very tight encirclement. Guderian, he's got a long way to go from that border, longer than Hort, but he's already diverting. Actually, this is a mistake I just see here. See this here? This is not supposed to be 26th. This is supposed to be 24th. But whatever. This 24th Panzer Corps, motorized corps is already... It's already shooting out for what we would probably think of as an exploitation period. And you can see another corps, the 47th, is doing what you would expect. Now here, is a break. You've got Kluge, who is the commander of the Fourth Army, and he is nominally therefore the commander of Panzer Group 2, because the Panzer Groups aren't autonomous, they come under the army command, and he is very concerned by keeping a tight encirclement. He wants forces to do two things. You've got to maintain the southern edge of your pocket, but you've also got to keep driving forward. So he cannot understand why the 24th Panzer Corps is driving out to the east when it should be closing on Minsk. Of course, Guderian resists this. Guderian is very much interested in exploitation. And there's a big clash between the two. So much so that at one point, Guderian thinks he's going to be fired because he does not get along with Kluge. There's a back history. You may already know they clash already in France. But what you can see here is a real division. And a lot of the books sort of classically back Guderian on this. He's the great panzer commander and he's the one who drives off and he's the forward-thinking guy. My take in my book when I'm looking at all these files is I don't know that there's a missed opportunity. I don't know that there's a right solution. I think they're both right. Kluge is correct. This is the battle you are fighting right now. There are hundreds of thousands of Soviets and you need to keep them in your pocket. There's no point in exploiting before you've closed the pocket. Why do I say that? Because Guderian's going to do this time and again. And part of the operational advantage is lost if you don't close the pocket. In fact, we will see that already in the back end of our presentation. But at the same time, exploitation's a thing. If you've locked up the enemy, you do need to work with that. So, there's a big division here. It becomes very acrimonious. Both Kluge and Guderian look for resolution, not by convincing the other, but by appealing to Bock and ultimately to Helder, so the Army Group Center Commander and the Chief of the Army General Staff. Those two ultimately back neither. They ultimately see the virtue of both of them. They try to provision both of them, which gives you an imperfect solution, but I don't think that there was a perfect solution. I obviously was supposed to highlight where these things were happening. There you go. That's Panzer Group 3. And then we've got sort of Panzer Group 2 there. And I think it's now time we better move on. So we now are at the 1st of July. And we can now see quite clearly the formation of the pocket at Minsk. So what we typically refer to as the Battle of Minsk, I always say this to students at the undergraduate level, because we have no other language for it, what happens on the Eastern Front is we give names to battles that center on cities. So this is the Battle of Minsk. In theory, it really should be called the Battle of Belarus. In the same way, the Battle of Smolensk really should be the Battle of Central Russia. The Battle of Kiev should be the Battle of the Central Ukraine, because these are much bigger than just, I think always my students have this idea that in this town because it's really not very big, Minsk at that point, but in this city of Minsk, that's where this fighting is taking place. In the way Stalingrad is, yes, it's a city fight, although also you could understand the Stalingrad campaign is much bigger. The point I would make with this map, if this map is starting to tell a story, keeping in mind that now we're a good sort of week into Barbarossa, and I want to illustrate that by reading to you. I know people don't necessarily want me to read them files, but this one I'll make an exception for. It's in the Tagesmeldung for Army Group Center. And what we're basically seeing is the separation. What I said before about there are two armies invading the Soviet Union. In those initial days, there was still a degree of contact and perhaps even a degree of support. I wouldn't want to overstate that, and it depends on where you are. But and maybe less so for Army Group Center and North, more so for Army Group South. But there was a degree of contact. There was the ability for infantry to, in some ways, support. Again, depending on where you are. But now there's a very real problem that's emerging for Army Group Center. And here's what the report says. This is from the 3rd of July, so it's actually 2 days on from where our map is. The problem appearing from now on in its full magnitude, which must be the constant worry of all responsible departments of the Army Group commands, is the daily widening of the distance between the panzer groups and the infantry armies. While until now this distance has had relatively little effect, the early renewal of the advance by the panzer groups with an objective over 500 kilometers away will have the result that 100 to 200 kilometer long stretches, I would say at least that, behind the panzer groups are more or less empty of German troops. That these extensive areas are being traversed by panzer troops almost entirely on the road, means that everywhere there are still strong enemy elements roaming and a constant danger exists to the supply and communications of the panzer groups. I think that says so much. The armored spearhead, those fighting formations that we will typically focus on, are definitely driving on. They are at the forefront of the German advance, but they need fuel and they need ammunition. And how are we getting that? They certainly haven't extended the railheads by any means. You probably know that the rail gauge is different. Those are things that people always write about. They have to convert them. That conversion process is slow. It certainly cannot keep pace with the German panzer groups in these opening weeks. So the only way to do it is, the German term for this is the Großtransportraum. It's basically these truck-based supply columns that are going to move through this area. Now, if you've just advanced on the roads because you're prioritizing speed, you're not really capturing the area. So there's a whole lot of Soviets, in some cases, who don't even know, because command and control has been lost. They don't even know where the German forces are. They don't know they're behind the front. But if they get to a road, then they see, what do they see? Very thin-skinned, very unprotected German forces that are absolutely essential to Barbarossa, driving back and forth. These are very easy targets. In fact, one of the photos I've got, I think, for one of my Barbarossa lectures, is just a photo of a Soviet road. And you get, a picture tells 1,000 words. It's incredibly sandy. You can just see it. No one's even driven down the road. It's not, you can just see it. It looks like beach sand on the road. Then you can see how close the trees are to the road, and then you just see a wrecked German column on that road that has sort of been pushed to the sides. You can see how easy it would be, and these aren't partisans. These are Red Army formations. And yes, they've sort of broken down from that top level. They don't function as armies or corps or divisions, but guys with guns are still dangerous, especially to thin-skinned vehicles. To parallel what I just read to you, so that's an army group file that has been disseminated. In parallel, this is one of those wonderful things of spending a lot of time on research. I found on the exact same day from a non-commissioned officer in a published diary. Actually, I think I put a thing on that. Oh, yeah, I got little lines just to illustrate where are these separations taking place. These are this gap, this emerging gap, and keep in mind that's talking about not right now where this map is focused, but into the future, getting wider. But the map. So hang on, I was going to show you that. Oops, wrong thing. Yeah, this is the diary. It was published a long time ago. Wilhelm Pöhler's book on the diary of a German soldier. On the 3rd of July, same day that Army Group Center was writing that, he comes to the same conclusion in his diary. It's a wonderful passage. I'll just read it to you. The whole war takes place more or less on the road. Without securing the land lying to the right or left of the road, we move along and reach each appointed goal. How many Russians must be cruising around the country still? How many enemy tanks are off the road, hidden in protected positions, waiting for the right opportunity to rush up behind the troops and raise hell? Funny the way this war is being waged. He is basically putting his finger right on this operational problem. Well, it's all very well for us to drive through the countryside, but we're not actually capturing the land. There's the virgin forests and swamps, especially in this area. We're not capturing that. We're prioritizing the next stage of the advance. He's concerned by, maybe it's fine if you're at the forefront in a motorized division as he is, but it poses very real questions for that supply column. And if you lose your supplies, of course, that's going to implicate the ability to keep driving this advance forward. Okay, so I realize I've got to keep going on here. We're on the 7th of July. So we've got a map here, and what I want to show you first of all, and this is the wonderful thing about David Glantz's maps, we're getting a lot of rich German detail. Of course, I do German military history. I don't have Russian. I didn't spend time in the Russian archives, and thankfully, people like Glantz have done a lot of that work. So what I want to show you here is just quickly a flash onto the Soviet side of the front. One of the suppositions, whoops, I'm not quite there yet. One of the suppositions for the Barbarossa campaign, going back to that war directive, looking at just what the plan is, I suspect many of you already know this. It's built on the idea of border battles. They are going to break through the front. They're going to destroy the Soviet formations near the front. That will be the main event. Destroy them. Battle of Minsk. You can see other battles in other parts of the front. And then they move into this exploitation phase where they will just kind of advance into the country. That's why it's a 6 to 10 week campaign, because you don't really fight the same battles 200, 300, 400, 500, 600 kilometers into the Soviet Union that you fought on the borders. The borders are the big battles. That's where the Soviet army is. And they're not necessarily wrong in that. It's not that they can't figure out that the intelligence is all wrong and the Soviet army is somewhere else. No, those covering armies are very much on the border. What's happening in parallel, and this is what makes it difficult for the Germans, and also because no army's ever done this, is that fourth generation idea that Glantz does so well in unpacking. In other words, yeah, there are, 2.7 or something million Soviet soldiers in these Western military districts. But of course, fourth generation is raising millions more to the colors, and that is happening over the course of these early weeks of Barbarossa. They form up in this sort of second strategic echelon and third strategic echelon. What we're seeing on the map here is the second strategic echelon. So the Germans who have now destroyed these main armies, or at least by this stage, the Battle of Minsk is over. They're now driving into the country and expecting less resistance. It should be easier the further they get. But actually, what's going on is there are many more Soviet armies being formed. That presents a problem. The problem is those panzer groups are unsupported to the rear by their infantry formations, the backbone of the German army, and they are not driving into empty space. They are very much driving into more Soviet forces that are forming up. Got some cross-channel going on. So a very real problem that will become more apparent. So what's the German goal at this point in the second phase? Well, unambiguously, they're going to replicate the success they've already had at Minsk. They're going to enact another encirclement. If you take Minsk, it's about 300 kilometers from the German-Soviet border, and then it's roughly the same again to Smolensk. So we've basically got to replicate the whole thing. But there are new problems, not just the problems I've spoken to about, the Germans have got logistical issues. There were all kinds of innovations. They knew they were going to face a lot of problems. In fact, there's a lot, if we would trace through the planning for Barbarossa, where the German staff work is not bad. I mean, there's a lot of things that inform the problems of Barbarossa that you can say are failings on the German side. But the staff work that's being done does allude to a lot of problems. It's very clear they know the distances, they know what they're going to be up against. So there's all these kind of innovations. Like in the opening phase, the German panzers will get much further in that first operational encirclement than they will. Partly, yes, because they are full tanks and driving from a starting position, and yes, all this stuff about dust in the engines, but also things that you don't really read very often. For example, they give tanks trailers in the opening part of Barbarossa to just carry fuel tanks on them, right? And so they can basically drive as far as the engine will allow, and then not having to get any supply, they just go to the trailer and refill from those. But what a lot of the tanks do is they don't really like having these trailers, and they basically ditch them within opening days and weeks, or certainly once they're empty. They just see them as ballast and get rid of them. None of this sort of stuff do they have. They don't have stockpiles. They don't have the rail heads. And to some extent, they've got this compromised mobility to begin this second operation, which means it's going to be slower, and they're not also just progressing against open space. They have certainly got Soviet formations. I'll stick to my plan here because I've got to follow a bit of a script. I'm not at that part yet. Sorry, I'll take my little markings off the map there. On the 7th of July, Bock, the commander of Army Group Center, writes, "It has been raining on 4th Panzer Army for 2 days. This has made the conditions on the roads frightful and in places an unusually heavy strain on the men and material." So that's the other thing. We are now 2 weeks into Barbarossa, and there have been showers. The other thing that does is we all know the Rasputitsa, when we get into October, the rains make the roads muddy. That is definitely true also of the summer. There are downpours, and they are struck by these unsealed roads and how that transformed them. That's also something you probably read, but we typically see that as a later phenomenon when the rains really start. But it impacts Barbarossa, and it compromises mobility in a way that these other factors just compound as well. The other thing I would say on that, as a purely anecdotal point, but students say to me they like these kind of anecdotal points. I spent some time in Russia back in the day when you could, and we went out to the Vyazma battlefields, okay, a little bit further into Russia, but I suspect it's probably the same. And on the day we were going out there, the same thing happened. We had a very light rain. I was extremely struck by what was solid ground in very light rain became my shoes were sinking into the ground. And I said to someone there, I said, "It's amazing. It's just a little bit of rain and we're already sinking into the ground." He said, yeah, that's just this region, don't you know? And I thought, wow, it's the difference between doing history and reading it all through files and actually being there and seeing a light rain and my shoes are sinking into the forest floor. It's remarkable, this transformation. I have to say, maybe it's because I come from a very dry continent. Australia is extremely dry. That definitely does not happen here. I was struck by the extent to which a light rain produced such a result. Wilhelm Prüller, I have another little quote from our non-commissioned guy in the Motorized Infantry Corps. It comes from the day before, on the 6th of July. The advance goes very slowly. Numerous obstacles are slowing down our charge. You really can't call what we're on a road. It's better than this on the tiniest hamlet in Germany. And we're marching on a main road. The shoulders of the road are all muddy from the previous rain. You sink in up to your knees. But in the middle of the road, there's already dust. Each vehicle is surrounded by a cloud of dust. It's remarkable that he would put these together. There's been a bit of rain, so we're sinking in. If that's an exaggeration, I almost imagine it has to be, sinking in up to your knees, but you get the point. It's certainly soft ground, and yet in the middle of the road where it's dried, you're again driving in the clouds of dust. You really can't get this middle road. It's sort of bad for the Germans either way. Either it's boggy because it's rained, and you would think the rain would at least dampen down the dust, but in fact it dries so quickly that they're again driving in it. So you have very real problems. The other thing here, and this is the next part where you'll have to watch the slide, we've got the 18th Panzer Division and the 3rd Panzer Division. You know, these slides are so busy, there's so many formations, I thought I'd highlight them for you. Because on the 7th of July, we're starting to get the very first figures from the Panzer Group war diaries on what is their operational capability. The 18th and the 3rd Panzer Division are at just 35% combat readiness. That's coming from the Panzer Group War Diary. The 4th and the 17th, you can see those just highlighted on the map, are said to be at 60% combat ready, and the 10th was the strongest. That's the 10th, this is all Guderian, is the strongest, and it's at 80%. These are extremely worrying figures, especially the 18th and the 3rd. Now, it's not to say just because I say that's 35% combat readiness, that that's some sort of base and it always goes down. The figures actually do fluctuate because they are able to repair. They have field repair facilities, but they are compromised by two things. Number one, you need to be able to get the vehicle to them, right? If it breaks down in certain ways, I keep in mind they're all scattered around and so on, that's a problem because they don't really have this heavy lift. They developed that over 1942 to really be able to transport and repair things. The other thing, there's only a finite amount of spare parts. There's only so many things in their repertoire. So the earliest phase, they can repair them quicker than the longer it goes on. The longer it goes on, the more the fallout rate will just be totally lost because there's not the ability to replace them. And the quintessential problem that they're dealing with, although there's a number of subdivisions in the parts areas that are problems, is engines. That is the one thing that is particularly catastrophic because even if you could imagine, well, where did they repair the tanks after the previous campaigns? They don't repair them in the field. That's why they don't have this ability. They win the campaign, virtue for the Germans, and then they transport them by rail back to the factories and repair them. The problem of losing your engines is the German war economy, which is a very strategic thing. You have to have a doctrine for this. You have to build for this, and you cannot improvise. It doesn't produce more tank engines than it does plan to produce tanks. So there's not a couple of hundred spare engines, even if you could put them in the machines that are being produced. There's only so many engines for the amount of tanks we're going to build. Because why would you? Who would imagine that the engine won't last longer than the tank itself? But that's going to be the story of Barbarossa. Okay, what I've got now is a little bit of a montage. To give you a sense, I've sort of cleared the map. We're on the 7th of June. I think I'm at this part. And we're going to just watch the campaign develop. You know, a picture tells 1,000 words. So we're on the 7th of June. Then we get the 7th of July. Then we get the 13th of July. We're starting to watch the Battle of Smolensk unfold. Then we get the 16th of July. And then we get the 20th of July. And what we're seeing there is, again, the formation of this pocket. But I think we're also starting to see how those panzer groups are now entering into this phase where there are inner flanks, i.e. the encirclement of these multiple formations of the Soviets who are desperately fighting to try and get out. and the outer flanks, which are the second strategic echelon closing up on the German formation. So they're having to sort of fight in two directions. We're also seeing the replication of the Battle of Minsk in a very different fashion, in that Hort is closing Panzer Group 3 from the north, their formation. They're supposed to close it, I think it's Yatsarov or something. It's not on this map. And Hort is going to get there. The problem is, where is Guderian? He's in the south. He's got a big problem, and it's one that's not of his making. It's part of the strategic side of the Eastern Front. Because because Army Group South hasn't been able to advance in parallel, and that's because they're facing more Soviet forces. It's because the Pripyat marshes, it's not really easy to move through them, so the connection is already problematic. But it means that the southern flank of Army Group Center is naturally elongated and lengthened. It's really difficult, and that is causing Guderian. You can see the 24th Panzer Corps is being, down here. Whoops, where's my cursor? Is being deployed to try and hold this long southern flank. But we're also starting to see the beginnings of, again, the replication of the battle at Minsk, where Guderian is diverting the 46th Panzer Corps off to the east before he closes the Smolensk encirclement. This is going to rehash the same discussion that prefaced the last battle. Is Guderian prioritizing the battle at hand, the Battle of Smolensk, or is he prioritizing the exploitation phase, driving further to the east? Hort is not impressed by this because he's reached his objective. Now, where is the southern arm? It doesn't work if you have an almost closed encirclement. You have to have it completely closed. And Guderian is, if you look at Panzer Group 2 diary, he is very much now interested in further eastward advance. So he is not interested in driving up. And to spoil the story, to get ahead of ourselves a little bit, it's going to be actually ultimately up to Hort to do it, because Guderian's kind of abrogated that responsibility. As far as he's concerned, I've given them the 47th Panzer Corps. You can see them in the south here. They've taken the town of Smolensk. They're holding the southern arc. And it's up to Hort to close the encirclement. This will go on for some days before Hort can do it, and the whole time Soviet forces are escaping that pocket. So there is a cost to this, no question. Bock writes on the 20th of July, exactly the day that we're looking at on this map. He is frustrated. He's aware of where the frustrations come in. He writes, at the moment, there is only one pocket on the army group's front, and it has a hole, exclamation point. One of the things I read out before, it might have just gone over your heads. I talked about the 4th Panzer Army. There used to be a 4th Army. Then they basically promote Kluge to being the 4th Panzer Army. Now, there is a 4th Panzer Army that comes out on the 1st of January 1942. That's the 4th Panzer Army we know. In some ways, this is the first iteration of that Panzer Army, but it's a very different 4th Panzer Army. 4th Panzer Army becomes what was Panzer Group 4. At this point, it's an attempt to deal with particularly Guderian. The idea being, if you put the 3rd Panzer Group and the 2nd Panzer Group under someone like Kluge, call it the 4th Panzer Army, you can keep a very tight rein on him. But of course, that assumes that Guderian is a team player and is going to follow orders, because he's not really been following Bock's orders. You know, in fact, I don't mind saying, and this is maybe a little bit of a departure from our point here, but it's something of my own evolution. If I didn't know then, I didn't write this at that point. It's not in this book, but one of the things I learned in the last book I did on these Hitler's Panzer generals, and not to switch gears here, but that book is basically based on the private letters of 4 different Panzer Group commanders. It's extremely instructive because these are letters, these are contemporary documents written by these guys, and I don't think any of them at the time wrote them with the idea that, oh, this is one day a historical source. These were private letters being written to their wives, and this is an age where people don't publish the letters of generals. These days, if you were, I don't know, some American commander in Afghanistan and you wrote private letters to your wife, you'd probably be smart enough to know someone's one day going to be reading these. So you might have different things in mind when you write them. That's not the case for our German generals. And one of the things that comes out of those letters is I think there's like 140 of them if you put them all together for Schmidt, Reinhardt, Guderian, etc. is these guys are extremely, I guess it's the ethos you need to have. It's the thing I learned out of reading all of that. And it's something I wasn't aware of when I was writing this. They are extremely headstrong individuals. They are not part of I think the canon of the German army, i.e., well, I understand I'm a part of a wider whole and I serve my role. No, they get to where they get to, and the ethos of the Panzertruppe is different from some of the other services because they are so headstrong. In some ways, that does make sense to me. If you're going to be a commander who's going to break through the front and say, to hell with the flanks, no, we just drive forward, that sounds bold and daring and dashing and all the rest of it. It also speaks to a certain character. That's a dangerous thing to do in context of how military operations typically operate. It also means if they are prepared to be those kinds of individuals, they often have very short shift for their commanders and frankly for their neighboring units. They are men who are headstrong, I would say, to a fault. They don't care for any other part of the front. They want all the resources for themselves. That really compromises their ability to understand what their operations mean in a wider whole. It is very much about my objective. Some who are very cynical might say my glory, my objective, and to hell with anyone else. This is part of the problem with Guderian, and frankly, I don't have Hermann Hort's letters. There are none as far as we're aware. I don't think he fits this. He does seem to be, if you look at his service over sort of 2 years on the Eastern Front, he is much more a team player. But if I can speak to the ethos of the Panzertruppe, because I have the private letters of 4 of these guys, keep in mind there are only 6 men who reach Panzer Group command in 1941. So the only 2 I don't have in my letters are Kleist and Hort. But the other 4 that I have all represent these traits. I'll let you read that book and we'll steer clear of that topic. But it speaks to part of the problem. Yes, Guderian is even among these men probably the most egregious offender, but it's a real problem with keeping him on the page. And ultimately, to tie us back to our theme, what happens to the 4th Panzer Army? It's made defunct at the end of July 1941. Why? Because it's ineffective. Guderian doesn't listen. He doesn't care, which tells us where we're headed with this slide. So now we'll move on. Oh, yeah. Okay, so I'm supposed to illustrate to all of you where all these formations are. You can see that long southern flank that he's trying to hold. You can also see this is where his 1 Panzer Corps that's holding the southern flank of the Smolensk encirclement. And you can see this is the recalcitrance. This is the 46th Panzer Corps being already diverted, not to linking up with Hort. And look how close he was to doing it. But not doing it. He's off. Okay, so a little bit of a break here. This is just a break from operational maps. I think even you guys might be prepared to say, David, it's enough already. Give us a break. One of the things that's happening in parallel, and this is just to zoom out, but it illustrates a point, and it does it very well. If one of the problems that's undermining Barbarossa already in real time, already in the summer of 41, are losses. Now, these losses are, yes, all about Panzer forces because we can measure that. And we can measure that in terms of, how many men are missing from the various infantry divisions, although the infantry divisions haven't yet really suffered much casualties. Why? Because they're mopping up at this stage. It's only about now that after a month of extremely hard marching, they get up to this front line to begin, and this is the most advanced infantry division. Some of them are still trying to get there. They won't get there till really the end of July, even August, before they start butting up against the front where they can really start deploying their artillery and doing what infantry do, which is fighting. They are already suffering attrition. They're suffering dropout rates. Just to give you a quick snapshot on what does that mean, I do sort of top-down history, so all these files, but I also do bottom-up history, which is, I wanted all the diaries and letters and things I could get from average German soldiers to see what the lived experience of Barbarossa is. And in these initial weeks, it's marching. It's heavy duty marching. I mean, the maximum I read was, I think 45 kilometers in a day. I'm not very good at converting these things to miles. Hopefully you guys can do that. What is that? 30 miles maybe? In a day marching in a full uniform in the middle of summer on shitty roads and sometimes carrying equipment, right? You got to carry your rifle. You maybe have a backpack. Some of these guys even have ammunition things. You're marching with this stuff. It's punishing. I'll give you 2 examples. one of these letters that I got for this book talked about the fact that some of our guys fall out. They can't keep up with the march because it's so punishing. We had three guys fall out yesterday. One of them has since died, which is pretty remarkable, right? That's already telling a story. And another guy writes, yeah, this thing, you can't understand how inhuman this march is. It's so punishing. We only get a few hours sleep a night, and then we have to replicate again what we're doing in the heat of the summer. The only escape people see from this, and we're already hearing talk of it, is suicide. I mean, that's not something I've read in any other campaign of any other. I mean, I'm not saying infantrymen don't suffer in other
Hey,
campaigns too.
David,
Yeah, yeah,
this
go
is
ahead.
Craig. If I can just, first of all, nice to see you.
Nice to
Um,
see you too.
yeah. Um, on your last point, one of the diaries I used in Barbarossa Unleashed was from a German doctor in the 6th Infantry Division. His name was von Lerov. And I don't remember how, it was so many years ago, but I got in touch with one of his sons who lived in Switzerland, and he provided me with his father's diary. Well, on one of the first days of the campaign, he talks, it's a hot day. They're marching on these horrible, dusty roads, and a vehicle passes by, passenger vehicle with the band leader. The band leader is an older man. He's in his like late 40s, early 50s. And, it's Lirov knows him. So it's hello, how you doing? And everything's fine. By the end of the day, he finds out that the band leader is dead. He died of heat stroke.
Yeah. And you have to keep in mind, this isn't the German army of 44 where there's a bunch of 40-year-olds walking down the road.
Yeah.
I'll be kind to the 40-year-olds, but, I'm not sure, you get Volksstrom, which would be right into the 50s and 60s, right? These are still young guys. This is the Barbarossa army. If that sort of thing, I mean, one of the things I would also caution, and I know I'm guilty of it, people can be guilty of it, we tend to find these things, and the more extreme the story, the more appealing that is to write it down. And I sometimes wonder with military history if we don't end up with the most extreme stories that people then think, especially if we're talking to undergraduates and perhaps not an audience as well read as this one, but they think, oh, that's what's happening. Every German soldier, every unit has people dying in the summer. That's not the case, right? That's not the case. But at the same time, that's an extraordinary fact that it's happening at all, that we can find those things. Because also, if I go back 15 years to when I wrote this book, I was writing about panzer groups. I was looking for information there. I was anecdotally looking for things on the infantry divisions. And of course, there's many more of them. And if I'm already coming up with those kinds of stories, I think that speaks a lot to what's going on. Okay, so this slide, and the basic thing I wanted to do here with it was just allude to the fact that this is a
David,
cost.
Mark
Oh, yeah.
has a question for you.
Sorry, I didn't say that. Go ahead, Mark.
Yeah, thanks, Alex. Thanks very much, David. When it comes to the 45 kilometers per day, was that what was budgeted in for the infantry that they from the get-go, the expectation was that they had to do that, or was that a reaction to the Panzer Corps going too fast and increasing the distance that they had to catch up?
Okay, so they are absolutely, it's daily orders going down that they need those infantry divisions forward. So there is always that. There's not a mandated, I mean, there might be at the divisional level, for this particular division, but I don't think we can make a broad comment on that across the Eastern Front because everywhere it's different. In some of the cases, they are much closer. So if we go back a slide, maybe we can see. Oops, am I going backwards? Yes. You can see infantry divisions down the south here are already butting up to the Pripyat marshes and are coming in to support the 24th Panzer Corps. So they have less distance. They're already deploying at the front. Others are desperately, if we take the 129th here, I imagine they are, you can see they're already stretched out over this huge distance, right? So there's no one size fits all. I think I'm trying to do this from memory. My supposition is, God, this has gone back a while, but that 45 comment is coming from Heinrich's diary. He's a corps commander on the Eastern Front, and I think it's there that he's writing about that distance but that's also a very, very high distance. I mean, 45 kilometers is, I don't know if I could do that, right? Like that is such a long way to try and get, and the idea is it's cumulative as well, right? It's day after day in the middle of the heat. So depending on where you are, is depending on what you're getting, and they are aware. Like I remember that there was one infantry division I read about where they recognized what was happening to their unit, and they basically said we're going to declare a day off, which is an extraordinary thing given the time pressures, but just to, I think, close up, let other units catch up, and just to rest everybody. The other thing is the classic indicator, there's 625,000 horses in Barbarossa. And the classic representation of horse losses is a sort of autumn phenomena, a winter phenomena where, for understandable reasons, these horses are emaciated and then there's not enough fodder and all the rest of it. And so we start seeing huge horse losses. I was already seeing reports of, oh God, we're losing a lot of horses in the summer for the same reasons. The endurance, and of course, they're carting field kitchens and artillery pieces and all the rest of it. It's even harder for them. So it's across the board, and it's a real problem. But I think there's no generic answer to mandated distances, and 45 kilometers. I think that's extreme. Also, that's the exception rather than the rule. But
Yeah,
I would
precisely.
think it would be 30 kilometers a day. This is. What do they say in the Wehrmacht? Sweat saves blood. That's never more. That's usually used in terms of training, but that's the same ethos here. We need to get to the front, and they also think we can burn our infantry divisions out. I mean, this is going to be a short campaign, right? No one's planning for 4 years of Eastern Front fighting. This is going to be over in a couple of weeks, so we can't dither. Am I going back forward?
If I could just add a couple of things about horses real quick. I've read these accounts where the German soldiers are crying because of the suffering of the horses, and horses, they only go so far and so fast. You can order a man at gunpoint, I suppose, to keep marching, but the horses, when they're done, they're done. And that was always a factor, really. Caring for the horses a lot more, giving them rest, giving them water, giving them fodder, whatever, way before they cared about the men.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's another one of those areas where, in the same way that motorization there's only so much of it, right? There's no alternative. There's 600,000 vehicles in Barbarossa, but they've scraped Europe clean. I mean, I got right into it and started to realize, hey, they were buying them from Switzerland. They bought thousands of vehicles from Switzerland. They'd gone right through the French army. They had British vehicles because they captured them from the BEF and had those. Those were the guys doing the British vehicles were allocated to the railway troops and so on. They'd even gone to Vichy, France, and said, hey, get some of those vehicles out of North Africa. It's remarkable. So what that tells you is, okay, it's not as though, which is what I'd always assumed before I started doing real research on Barbarossa, well, why didn't the Germans just, if they lacked motorization, why didn't they just prepare better for it? Oh, they were. They did this. As I said earlier, the staff work is there. They recognize that this is all going to depend on mobility, but it also compounds that. And these are secondary things. These are things that typically don't get into a lot of the military histories that are written because people are not really looking at that level of detail. And I don't know how sexy it is for books to talk about, okay, so what are second order factors on spare parts, or how many different types of vehicles are there, and what sorts of production runs do they have, and what are the available? And if you've got Romanian cars and Czech cars and all the rest of it, you can start to see how when that breaks down, that's just pushed to the side of the road. We're never going to bother with it because who knows where the next set of spare parts for that is. Okay. Lest I keep you up all night, I'll continue on. The 22nd of June, 1941 is where we're at. This is the new picture we're looking at. You can see Yatsavo here, which is where Hort's gotten to. But the thing I want to zero in now is I want to return to the idea of what does this all cost them? Remember, we've sort of had a bit of a montage where I took you over now. We've been going for a month into this campaign. And it's at this point we start to get some really, what I would say, frightening figures. And I don't mind saying I had no pre-science going into a PhD doing this research that I was going to find the things I was going to find. Those conversations that I was having with Muller at this time, as I would sort of share with him every sort of 6 months, and I'd sort of go in and say, oh, Professor, this is what I found. I remember him having a few moments of pause saying, really? Can you show me that? Is that right? And which I think speaks to the fact that this is alarming, right? And again, you only find this by going down into these deeper shifted files. Okay, so on the 22nd of June, so at the invasion, Guderian's Panzer Group has 953 tanks, all models. By the 29th of July, oh, hang on, I'm on the 22nd. Sorry, maybe I have to take us a bit further ahead. Okay, we're doing a montage again. Sorry, I got that wrong. 22nd of July, 24th of July, 26th of July, 28th of July, 30th of July. You can see the closing of the Smolensk encirclement. So that's basically where we are. This report comes from the 29th of July. Of the 953 German tanks in Guderian's Panzer Group, he has on the 29th 286. That's only 30% of the original strength. The diary then writes, this figure is underlined exceedingly low. Of the remaining tanks, no less than 132 were Mark 1s. Mark 1s are a terrible tank. That's a first iteration tank. The Germans are figuring out how the tanks work. It's basically got a machine gun in it. I'm so sorry. I'm sorry. I've got that wrong. Forget that. Of the remaining tanks, no less than 132 were Mark 1s and Mark 2s. Sorry, I thought they were all Mark 1s. There are only 4 of that 132, only 4 of them are Mark 1s and 128 are Mark 2s. In other words, these are small tanks, let's just say, and you could say somewhat obsolete by this point already in the war. In addition, armored command vehicles constitute another 19 on the list. So these are important tanks, but they're not going to break through the Soviet front. Only 97 tanks remaining to Guderian are Mark 3s and 38 are Mark 4s. Okay, that's a bit more detail than perhaps people want, but you get the point, right? There is a very finite amount of strength left, and we are 5 weeks into Barbarossa. Guderians are lower than Hort's overall. Schmidt's 39th Panzer Corps has 40% serviceability, and Kunzen's 57th Panzer Corps is at just 30%. What accounts for this is 2 things, broadly speaking. It's the extent to which they're having to maneuver. I know that sounds a bit strange. One of the students once asked me a really good question. It's funny how when you work with this stuff, you don't think of these things. He said, I don't understand, David, why? I mean, if it's from the German border to Smolensk 600 kilometers, we're really saying German tanks can't go 600 kilometers? And I suddenly realized, he thinks of it, and I need to sometimes remember this, in terms of someone getting in a car and driving there, as though the trucks just drive, the tanks and things just drive down the road. I said, you have to understand on a daily level, they're maneuvering, they're going around flanks, they're attacking, they're moving back and forth, they might have to drive back to where their supplies are. There's constant churn. They've moved much further than 600 kilometers in an aggregate sense. These tanks might even be moving 18 hours a day, right? With pauses for whatever rest and refueling and all the rest of it. But the aggregate sum on a tank engine is far greater than just the distance left to right. So these are worrying figures. It's also around this time that I started getting personnel losses. So we spoke to that in the last slide where we had these propaganda images. These propaganda images, oh yeah, I didn't really mention this, sorry. There was a Soviet poster there that was basically something that was dropped to German lines in the summer of 41. Now, one of the things I would say about that is there's many German soldiers' letters and diaries that refer to these things being dropped very derisively. In fact, they're sometimes very appreciative of these Soviet propaganda posters because they give them A, a good laugh, and B, as one of these guys referred to, yeah, and we got some toilet paper now, right? So that's not a problem. And they find it comical. Oh, come and join the workers' paradise. You will be protected. They think this is hilarious. The only area that people who've done more work in this area than I have seem to realize the Soviets hit on something that's a chink in the mental armor of the German soldiers is exactly what some of those things that I put up there are alluding to, and that is German losses. That's something they can't avoid because it's something they see and it's very real. On the 29th of July, the same day we're getting these devastating figures for operational capabilities in Guderian's Panzer Group, they release figures. So the figure comes from, it's reported on the 29th of July, but it comes from the 25th of July. 20,000 men are missing from the Panzer Group. That's the loss rate. Now, it's not the whole story. They have had 10,000 replacements because there is something in Germany, the replacement army. They have something like 200, and I'm doing this from memory, 280,000 or something it is in the replacement army that are sending men east to fill those gaps. two things with that. That's also a finite amount. You're going to burn through the replacement army by the end of the summer, basically. The other thing is, it just doesn't mean a man for a man, especially in a panzer group. There is a specialization. In fact, one of the things that someone made the point a long time ago that was, I think, very salient. A lot of people don't know how to drive at this point, right? It's not like you can just put any old person into a tank. A tank is special, but anyone into a truck. A lot of people don't grow up with cars. Their parents don't have them. It's a specialty item, so they don't know how to drive. So you just can't assume those things. And of course, military training and operational capability to coordinate all of this, that's not something that man for man is replaced just because you've got a man. Hort's Panzer Group is similarly affected, but to nowhere near the same extent. He's suffering 7,500 casualties and 350 officers. As Rob's work from a wonderful journal article in the Journal of Slavic Military History from a couple of years ago has shown, those officer casualties are very real. They are biting initially, and there is absolutely not, even though we just talked about that replacement army, the same thing doesn't exist in parallel for officers. That's a real problem. Now, it doesn't mean that there isn't a degree of improvisation, but it's a finite resource. What are the Germans doing? If there aren't officers, they're basically promoting NCOs. Oh, that was me coming back as feedback. Yeah, that's how they're trying to solve these problems. Oops, hang on, I'm supposed to be advancing on my other computer. Okay, so what we're starting to see here, now we're on the 4th of August. Am I going one more? Yes, I'm going one more. Okay, I like this slide. Battle of Smolensk is concluded. We've had two major encirclements, Minsk, Smolensk. That's largely what my book was focused on, looking at those. But I continue on to basically around the end of August. I get about 2 months in, so we're not quite at the end. But what we're seeing here is the realization of what Barbarossa has cost them. What Glantz is doing there by representing these as circled, motorized and panzer divisions is they're being pulled out of the line to reconstitute. That they are recognizing how burnt out they are. And, the older literature used to represent this as, the missed opportunity. Oh, yes, after the Battle of Smolensk, they missed their opportunity to not exploit and continue on to Moscow and win the war. But, no, they lose this month. There's no losing of a month. There is something that's happening in parallel at the high command level, a debate which we'll get to in the next slide, something I haven't been talking about, but it informs the whole conversation that we've been having, but we're focused on operational detail. And this debate is basically, are we driving on Moscow? Are we going down to the Ukraine? But even at this point, while this debate continues on, two things are happening, which are absolutely essential to whatever the German command decide, and they're non-negotiable. One, they don't have supplies at the front. They're still extending those railheads. They're still trying to get, for whatever your next phase is, you've got to have fuel, you've got to have ammunition, you've got to have the ability to jump off. And that's not yet there. They're going to need these days and weeks in order to build that up. But the other thing that they're desperately trying to do is provisionally repair as many of these tanks, vehicles, and these workshops that are organic to the divisions. They're under-resourced, not just in terms of the spare parts, but just in terms of manpower, right? They've got every mechanic they possibly can work, but they can't work wonders. And they've already consumed a lot of their supplies. There's a constant, we need to get more things. In fact, when Hitler visits the front, he does it in early August, and he has private meetings with Hort and with Guderian, as well as with the Army Group Command. The one thing they're emphasizing to him is we need hundreds of engines, and we need them now. And of course, it goes back to those problems I was referring to earlier. Where's this all this coming from? You can't just click your fingers and industrial production turns up. That's a long-term thing, and there's really no decision anyone can make to fix that kind of problem. Okay, I have another set of books there that I thought it would be remiss of me not to represent. Glantz is going to be a theme of anything you talk about on the Eastern Front, and he did this wonderful series on, which is, it never says it, it does say it there. It's a Battle of Smolensk in, vast detail from very much a Soviet side. It's the sort of, I guess it's the parallel to some of the stuff I've been doing. Okay, so I gave you this slide as a bit of a reminder to me, as a switching gears, I guess, but to talk about what informs this campaign in the rear area. And make a long story short, prior in the planning phases, Hitler is already talking about getting to about the point on the campaign map that we are at, and then he sees a diversion of the panzer strength from the center to the flanks. He sees Leningrad, he sees the Ukraine as being more important. And that is not the view of Brauchitsch, the gentleman on the left, and it is certainly not the view of Halder on the right. Now, Brauchitsch is a bit of a secondary personality, even though he's the commander-in-chief of the German army. He is a very weak character. That's perfect for Hitler. That's why he's there. That's why he's picked. It's the same reason why Keitel is the perfect guy for the head of the OKW. He doesn't like strong personalities, right? Halder is different. Halder is, I guess you could say, the power behind the throne. A very forceful personality and has a very different idea. His idea is, I'm not going to challenge Hitler on this flanks discussion because why should I? We'll probably win the campaign in these initial weeks anyway, and it'll become academic, so why have the big clash? But I am absolutely not in favor of this diversion to the flanks. You have to cut the head off, as he sees it. You drive on Moscow, that's got to be the plan. In other words, there's never been a resolution, but there is clearly a difference of opinion about how Barbarossa should continue. And right through this early weeks of the campaign, there's been this back and forth, this very private discussion within the OKH, which are nominally in charge of running this whole campaign, although Hitler is daily getting his meetings and will obviously intervene. But their idea is this has got to continue. At all costs, it's got to continue. And as we just saw on that map, the perennial problem that the Germans face, which is not one they thought about, and actually this is not represented in the files. It's not represented in the files, and I was shocked by that. The one thing they should all have been focused on is your plan suggested that there's no real, especially after two major encirclements on the central part of the front where you've devoted most of your panzer forces. If there's one place you needed to be broken through by 5-6 weeks into the campaign, it's here. And yet there's an Eastern Front that should have worried them. I couldn't find a single piece of paper that really articulated, Jesus Christ, we've got a real problem here. How is it there's a solid front against us? We should have broken through here. But it makes this strategic debate all the more important. Perhaps that's where we do see a realization of Barbarossa's not where we thought it was, because there's no exploitation. There's no, we have all these panzer forces free now to help Army Group North and Army Group South, who obviously had a harder time. In the South, they've got a bigger front, they face more Soviet forces, and they have a smaller panzer group. So of course they're going to perhaps need some help from the center, but the center also has problems. And here's the other thing that really was illuminated for me. I think it's in the next slide. Yes. You might imagine, this is something that we owe a real debt to Glantz for. You might imagine, as I always had, growing up reading the books of the 70s, 80s, and 90s, that, well, at least in the center now it's quiet. Why would it be quiet? Because, well, they've won the Battle of Smolensk. Also because, well, they've pulled all their panzer forces off to recondition them. And now there's a strategic debate while they build up supplies and decide, are we going south? Are we going north? Are we going to go east and take Moscow? You would think it's quite quiet there. Those infantry forces have now closed up to the front. The 4th Army's there, the 9th Army's there, and they just have to hold the front. That is absolutely not what's going on. Glantz is quite categorical about the whole forgotten battles of the Eastern Front. And it's forgotten because, and this is something that he really trained me to start looking, and it becomes a big feature of the battle in the winter and all the rest of it without getting tied into all that. But just because we don't see the Eastern Front move, that's typically what I think military historians use as a bar for measuring where the action is, right? So if the front's moving, we see a lot of fighting. If we don't see the front moving, well, that must be because it's quiet, right? And that is the wrong way to understand the Eastern Front. It is such a misnomer. I mean, the classic representation, if we take the whole war on this, is, well, what do we see in 1942 and what does everyone always write about and where is the fighting taking place? Well, it's Stalingrad, of course. You can see a great German advance and you see a great German retreat. So that's where the war is being fought. And yet there are more casualties at Rezhev than the Stalingrad campaign. Where's Rezhev? Where is Rezhev? Is it on this map? It's not on this map. Doesn't matter. It's not important. But the point is, the front only moves by tens of kilometers at Rezhev. So on these scale maps, you hardly see it. And yet there are massive amounts of Soviet casualties and a huge amount of fighting. What's happening in August of 1941? The 9th Army is under enormous pressure. Some of the reports that come out of the 9th Army at that point, you would think are happening in 1943 or 44. They're really worried that the front's going to collapse and they're going to have they're broken through. They constantly keep sending reports to Panzer Group 3 saying, no, send another regiment back up to the front. It's all going to fall apart for us. It's hardly the victory style, well, this is the summer of 41 and the Germans are predominant. there's very much the word crisis in the German Army Group Center. Bock's worried about it. The infantry divisions are worried about it, and there's a real burn in terms of operational capability. Also, because these panzer divisions keep being pulled off and then being put back on the front because they have to plug gaps and so on, and it really undermines their ability to reconstitute. And so if we then look, and you all know how this ends, that operational debate, which is raging between the high commands, ultimately there was, although there's a lot of back and forth, and I chart that in great detail parallel to these campaigns, ultimately there's no real doubt. When Hitler finally makes up his mind, and it was always going to be Hitler's preference, where do they go? They're going south, and they actually also send one Panzer Corps, Schmidt's 39th Panzer Corps, or I think it's a motorized corps at this point, that goes north and helps encircle Leningrad. What is the bottom line? Because this is now very much the end, and I think we're probably even over time. I don't know what time it is, but we've been talking for a while here, so maybe we'll wrap it up and go to whatever questions you may have. But the bottom line when we get to this point in the campaign is, yeah, by no means is it over. And by no means am I trying to suggest that the Soviets are about to march on Moscow, about to march on Berlin. That is absolutely not the case. At the same time, if you look at the operational capability, I probably should have, if I think about it now, gone to those final figures I got for the end of August. But they are quite catastrophic. I think from memory, its Guderian's operational capability is about 25%. Now, that is not what I thought going into this book. I never thought it was that low. Why did I think it was that low? Because I, like everyone else, knows what comes next. Don't they win this great victory at Kiev? Not to get ahead of ourselves, but how's that possible with so few forces? It's possible for two reasons, and I'd say this is my introduction, my conclusion. It's less a reflection of German strength, which is what I always thought informed successes at Barbarossa. I think things like Kiev, like a lot of what we see in Barbarossa, is less a great German victory. Kiev is not a great German victory. It is, but it's informed by a terrible Soviet disaster. It's because the Soviets don't really resource what will be called the Central Front. It's because Stalin is obstinate and will not let anyone out of that great big Dnieper bend. It facilitates Guderian's very low operational ability to enact an outsized operational success. If they had been more aware or followed Zhukov's advice, why is Zhukov not the commander-in-chief of the Soviet army? Why does he get fired from that and get sort of demoted to front command? It's because he's suggesting earlier, weeks earlier, at the end of July, we need to be aware that these guys were most exposed in the northern Ukraine. He was quite right about that. But of course, Stalin wouldn't have it. In the same way that, in 1944, Hitler undermines German successes by this obstinate response, that's very much Stalin in this period, which allows the Germans to look like they are still dominating when that operational ability really is highly compromised. And I think that says a lot. And the back end of that title, Operation Barbarossa and Germany's Defeat in the East, not because Germany's about to lose the war, but because the implications of that finite resource being so burnt out in the summer prefaces the fact that this is not going to be won in an autumn campaign for all the successes that Typhoon will have, and we'll get into that at some other point. It's because the Germans simply don't have the ability to keep going on, and they've missed their boat, right? The idea of destroying the Red Army, that's maybe my final point. The Red Army gets bigger over 1941. It gets bigger. By the end of it, and this is going on glance, the Red Army numbers 8 million men. They're nowhere near as good as the army of the 22nd of June, but there they are, and you're going to have to deal with them. And if the most important part of the German army has been burned out, it's Helder himself who writes in his diary in November 1941, the army we had on the 22nd of June, we will never have again. And he's perfectly correct about that. Okay, thank you all very much.
Wow, what a tour de force. Thank you so much, David. Really generous and extensive look. Now, everybody who has questions, please raise their hands. Use that old Zoom function, and let's get to it.
Hey, David?
Yeah, go on, Craig.
It's Craig here. A couple of things. First of all, we know that Paulus, not fun Paulus, as some people like to say, but of course he had been brought in by Halder to kind of be his right-hand man and to sort of sketch out in more detail the Barbarossa plan. And in what's his name? Torsten, whoever did the biography of Paulus, Paulus, he has a great section where this is in the planning phase of Barbarossa, and Paulus is taking his work home at night. And his wife figures out, because she can see the maps. I guess he's not taking top secret stuff, but enough that she can see the maps, and she pretty clearly realizes what her husband is doing. He's planning to take Germany to war against Russia. And she's stunned and infuriated. And they have all these arguments with each other, as related by one of Paulus's sons. I think he had two sons that were both lieutenants in the army. And that's the kind of human story, anecdote that I always just find so incredible. And then on the 22nd of June, just immediately after, literally hours after the offensive had begun, Paulus walks into OKH headquarters, and Brauchitsch asks him, "So, Paulus, how long do you think this campaign is going to last?" And he says, 6 to 8 weeks, and it'll be over, Herr General. And Brauchitsch says, "Yes, I think you are indeed correct with that assumption." So,
yeah,
two kind of interesting anecdotes.
Absolutely. Maybe a point on that is having just spent this time on the German general's letters, that's quite common. Guderian has a letter before the war to his wife. Same thing. He's talking about Barbarossa.
Yeah.
Maybe I'll just back up a bit and just say, and Hoepener has one as well. So this is a bit of an open secret. When you consider the sensitivity of what they were planning, it's a remarkable what they will write, and how much they're sharing. Of course, their wives are also then like, who are they telling, right? This is not, it's not what's supposed to happen. Can I back up and maybe be a bit self-critical? But I like to, especially with a more expert audience, there's a very real question about why have I got these letters, and why did I not get these letters for these books? I'm going back 15 years. I went into the files. I found out about the Nachlasse, the private papers area. I saw that Guderian had letters. I read the Kenneth Maxey from the 70s. I knew that there was a set of letters. I made two incorrect suppositions. The first was, well, there's an ordinance on communication that pervades what German soldiers can write in their letters. German soldiers, to say nothing of generals. And you're not allowed to write about anything to do with the campaign. You can't mention your local commander. You can't mention where you are. There's a lot of rules, right? That makes sense. Well, maybe that's a bit extreme for soldiers, but my God, there's no way in all these letters that there's going to be anything about the operational details, because the German generals couldn't possibly include that, right? So my supposition was incorrect. There'll be no detail in there. It'll all be about, Auntie Bessie's varicose veins, and I hope your mother's doing well. Well, actually, Margrette's mother was dead, but whatever. It'll be that level of stuff. So the other thing is, you can't read these letters. I know that sounds odd. What do you mean you can't read them? Believe it or not, German generals didn't write with the same alphabet that we write with. That shocked me a little bit, and people often say to me at this point, "Oh yeah, that's Zutterlen, David. That's because they wrote in Zutterlen." No, it's not that. Zutterlen is only a Prussian reform of the early 20th century, and it's dealing with a bigger problem. So you imagine Germany long before Germany is Germany, when it's all these principalities, duchies, and states and things from the Holy Roman Empire. There's no set form on how do you form a letter of the alphabet. It's basically choose your own adventure, right? Everyone's doing it in different places, in all these little places. And then when Germany becomes Germany in 1871, there's a recognition that people come from even just inside Prussia, different areas, and they write letters differently. So it becomes hard to read. You can't always just read someone else's handwriting. In the early 20th century, they come up with Zutterlen. Now, even there, it's not the alphabet as we see it. There are some letters that are the same, and some that you look at and say, that's hieroglyphics from Egypt. What the hell's that? Oh, yeah, that's a G, or whatever the one is. And then it's only in the 1930s that they finally get to a Germany-wide, here's how we're going to do it. The bottom line is, German generals in the late 19th century, wherever as young boys they were, wherever they were born and grew up, That's the kind of handwriting they have. Guderian's, I can't read. And I showed it to German friends, just thinking, well, maybe that's my ability to read this wonky handwriting. No, they couldn't read it either. And they were immediately saying to me, David, anything written from this time is going to be. So I had two different people work through just to read the letters, right? Hence why I didn't do it back in the day, because I didn't have the resources and the money to pay for that. And I thought, well, even if they were very important, I would do it. But they weren't important because they weren't right about anything. It was only years later that I thought, you know what, I'd like to read them for myself finally. I'm going to pay the money since I get, thankfully, university support. They'll pay for these things. My God, when I sat there and read them, I suddenly realized, my God, they're rich as anything. They write about everything. My God, these are a treasure trove. And there was a lot more besides, not just the operational detail, a lot about who they were as men. Bottom line is I suddenly realized I need to do a book on this. I see all these other hands up, so sorry. I'll go to whoever's next.
Okay, thank you. Ralph, go on, Ralph.
Thanks. I'm just wondering with the distances, the challenges to supplying the front line. I'm just wondering, do you have any notion of how well or not well the Germans were eating, and whether they had to rely on foraging or terrorizing stealing from the peasants, from the civilians?
Yes, that is definitely a part of the planning for this. So logistics in Barbarossa are prioritized overwhelmingly to armaments and to fuel. They recognize that those are already going to be difficult to bring forward in the quantities required. So there is no provision made for food. Food is also it's extremely bulky. It's not heavy in the way that shells are and all the rest of it, but it's bulky. So it requires it requires transport space, which is something that the Germans get into in trying to quantify what we should prioritize sending east. So the idea is that they are going to live off the land, as they say. And this has very real implications for that parallel discussion you can have about this war. There is a war as we've explored it today, which is a conventional war. It's the war that we understand. It's the way in which we as Anglo-Americans engage with Barbarossa. It's, again, decades of literature that we all read. That's what Barbarossa is. That's what we understand it to be. That is not, and I say this as someone who attended a German university, that's not what they see Barbarossa as first and foremost. It is in their conception, first and foremost, a war of annihilation, as a Vernichtungskrieg, right? That's how they refer to it. And it's not just what perhaps we think in the first instance. Oh, yeah, this is the Holocaust, right? There's a Holocaust that goes on. It begins in the East. Oh, there's a war of annihilation, German soldiers. There's a Commissar order. I talked about that with Felix Römer before. It's things like this, and they're not wrong. So you imagine 3.5 million guys, or 3.2 million. Actually, it's more like 4 million if you start counting Finns in the north and Romanians in the south and Italians and Hungarians that turn up. There's a lot of guys heading east. But in concentrated areas like Belarus, where we've just looked, the reality for those villages is not, oh, well, we're going to have to share with the German army now. It's a unit coming through. They have to live off the land. That's their orders, that they've got to eat too, right? So when they get into these towns, they're looking for chickens, they're looking for eggs. And the villages, in some cases, there's guys with guns and all the rest of it will give over some of this. The problem is they go through in waves. They keep coming through. If you're the eighth wave going through a small peasant area, well, it's yes and no. They start to realize we got to get through a winter here, and we are impoverished, and we know if we don't have stuff, we'll starve. So they get to a point where they start saying, we've already given stuff. They keep coming through. We're not giving them any more. Hide it. So when the German soldiers start going through, they're like, we need food, we need some eggs or whatever. And they say, we don't have any. And then these German soldiers start being like, oh, for God's sake, well, I'm hungry. I'm going to start looking around. Then they find it. Oh, these people all lie to us. And this becomes the ethos. They've all got it. They just don't share, right? And they've no real sense. And in that sense, it's what I kind of term secondary criminality. There is criminality as we classically understand it, i.e. Germans do terrible things to people who they think are partisans or commissars. The classic sort of, we can all agree on that. It's harder to agree on, yeah, but they're taking their food And that has very real implications for these people in terms of what's going to happen to them. And it's happening on every level. Hey, they've got a horse. Let's take that horse because we need them. Hey, they've got farming implements. They've got shovels, whatever. You steal from people who have nothing. These people will not survive the winter, and there's no record of it, right? That they just won't survive. They're doing it with hospitals, taking medicine. They strip this land so bare. I would say the ability to survive is so compromised, these people lived close to the margins as it was, that you get this indirect criminality that is down to the soldier level. They don't intend to kill anybody. They're just taking food because, hungry. And sometimes they're not just hungry. Sometimes it's just great to have spare chickens, because it is. And they don't see this, but those are the implications. This is how you get to 14 million people being killed. It's not that they're all being shot. It's because the German army and the implications of this occupation are such that the conditions to survive in a very impoverished part of the world are being directly challenged by virtue of the Germans being there. Anyway, I'll stop there.
Alex, come on, Alex.
Yeah. Thanks, David. You mentioned again, the decision whether to go to Kiev or, someplace else. Again, the usual, of course, is, as you said, that they're going to march on Moscow and win the war. I just wonder if you could talk, that, of course, has been a debate amongst historians and wargamers for, forever. I just wanted you to, lay out, as far as you can, what would be the problems if the Germans had gone with that option? Going, keep on going east, forget about Kiev, let's just, take out the head and we'll win the war that way. Thank you.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. That is a classic debate, and I actually do have a fairly set opinion. Of course, hypotheticals are always hypotheticals. We only know what happened. My idea is if you were to drive straight to Moscow and say, okay, we're going to do that, you would have two very real problems. The first is the option to go into the Ukraine, as I said before, was informed by, this very much comes from Glantz, and I'll leave him to be the expert on the Soviet side because there's always two sides to a coin. He is quite explicit. The weakest formation on the Eastern Front for the Soviets was that Central Front. In that sense, Hitler's right. I mean, maybe not because Hitler knows this, of course he doesn't, but he ultimately picks the weakest point. And again, we shouldn't assess the strength of Guderian to just drive on Moscow. The other thing that's going on there is, and this is something we get very much from the Army files in September, when Typhoon initially jumps off, they have had the entire late August and the entirety of September to try and build up supplies to facilitate that typhoon. That would not have been the case if you just said, right, we're going in the end of August. Those supplies weren't there, and you had a stronger Soviet set of formations. The other thing that would be a direct implication of driving on Moscow, if you tried to at the end of August, is there is still the Soviet Southwestern Front, which is the strongest Soviet front by far, just the number of armies allocated to it. They are still there, absolutely still there. Yeah. With what forces are you covering this enormous... The Eastern Front isn't a north-south thing. It would be going all the way to wherever you get to the east and then extending. What German forces are spare to cover that enormously long southern flank? You have this very powerful army group, no real ability to encircle it, and you're extending your own flank for which you're going to have to divert forces. The virtue of Kiev is that you exploit that, you link up with Panzer Group 1, you win this tremendous operational success, devastate this biggest formation on the Eastern Front. And yeah, that delays time, and I'm not suggesting there's some golden opportunity, but for myself, I think there's a lot of questions. There's questions about resources in terms of German logistics. There's questions about the operational ability of the Germans to break through that Western Front because they don't have the strength that they will have built up by the time they get to Typhoon. Remember, Typhoon is all of Panzer Group 4. Where is Panzer Group 4? It's up near Leningrad, right? There's no ability for that to help break through that Western Front. So I'm actually, my feeling is, and of course it's a hypothetical, but my feeling is the right decision was, winning the whole of the Kiev, and that it's not just the Battle of Kiev, that facilitates the Battle on the Sea of Azov. That's also another 100,000 Soviet forces. It's 700 guns, 200 tanks. It's another huge operational success. It gets you into the Crimea. It unlocks the eastern Ukraine, which has got all those things. I think it's the right choice. If I had to make a guess, I don't think you'd have gotten anything like the same level of success. I don't see a scenario where they would have captured Moscow if only. I know that's the old thesis. What was that book in the 80s? Russell Stolfi, I think, wrote a book that suggested if only they'd done this, the war would have been won. I don't see it, but yeah.
All right, thank you. Michael.
Yeah, I just want to go back to the food issue for a second. When I was just in Normandy, I was told a story that members of the 12th SS came into a French village and said that they took all the chickens and killed them and cooked them and ate them. And then sometime after that, they came in and said, "Well, now we want eggs." And they said, "Well, we don't have eggs because we don't have chickens." Who ate them. I was just wondering if there were any, since they were going to live off the land, so to speak, for the most part, if there were any experts, if there was any research, anybody calculating how they were going to do that and what they would have to do to keep the resources going. I mean, that could easily also happen with grain and anything like that, since especially when it became a longer campaign. Were there any agricultural experts, anybody like that, advising them on what to do as far as living off the land?
Yes. So I'd say a couple of things on this. At the strategic level, yes. So if I went back to that book by Alex Kay, if you could read the subtitle to that, it talks about economic planning for the East. So at that strategic level, they are definitely looking at the Soviet Union in terms of these kinds of factors, but they're also looking at it not so much in terms of will we win the campaign and can our soldiers eat. That's not really the point. It's looking at the Soviet Union as an economic asset and how that would feed in. But some of that does have very real implications for how they understand, and they therefore do understand what they call deficit regions and surplus regions of the Soviet Union are. So to break that down very broadly and very simply without getting into it all, the Ukraine is a surplus region. Clearly it is. It's the Black Earth sort of area. You can grow stuff there. We know that about the Ukraine. And the north is definitely not like that. It's much less arid land, there's forests and swamps, but it's also the soil isn't very rich. It's very hard to grow things in there. That's also reflected by the population. It therefore means that you have richer in terms of, the peasantry and everything. Yes, I won't say they're rich because they've been through collectivization and all the rest of it, but nominally in these collective land farms, there's a greater wealth on the land in the south than in the north, and that's reflected in the German soldiers' experiences when they get there. They're often very shocked, and keep in mind, it's not that they're just shocked because they come from Germany. They have been deployed in Poland. What they start to realize is some of these Soviet areas are much poorer than even what they've experienced thus far. And there's a lot of derisive comments about, oh yeah, well, this is the workers' paradise. Have a look at this. It's devastating. The villagers don't see any real benefit of Soviet communism, right? They're just villagers and peasants, whatever they might put in their propaganda. But soldiers do notice a difference in towns and cities. That's where you do start to see that, well, there's been an economic model here that is created that they often refer to schools. Schools are much more modern, right? And factories are built and all this kind of thing. But that food issue is these Army Group North, Army Group South are heading into deficit territories. I haven't spent, this would be a question for me going forward. My research was absolutely focused on the files of panzer motorized units. If I spent a lot more time looking at infantry formations, I wonder if you would see perhaps something there. I doubt it. I think their idea was nobody in the German army is going to starve in the few weeks that we're actually going to be operationally active. There's certainly no real concern for what might happen to the people there. And if you look at the apocalyptic plans for the Grüne Mappa, basically the German ultimate plans for what's going to happen, people are going to be moved. I think it's 40 million people are going to be moved out of these areas because they are going to be German areas and we don't want so many Slavs. We're not going to need them. We can't feed them. We would use, what's the modern terminology for this? Ethnically cleansed. They didn't use those terms then. They'll be just sent east, right? Don't need them, don't want them in these areas that we can't bother to feed them anyway. But the lived reality, such as I'm aware, is German soldiers will just eat whatever they have, and there's not a fear, at least, expressed that they would be hungry. And admittedly, I haven't read reports, and maybe over to Craig and Rob and other such people, I haven't read reports, at least in the summer or even in the autumn of 41, of German soldiers. Yes, they might complain that they haven't eaten in a day or two because local conditions, but not of units semi-starving. I haven't read that.
Hey, David,
So,
I
yeah.
will say by the early fall of 1941, the 6th Infantry Division, which of course, Dr. Hoppe did that great book, wrote that great book on. They went a period of several weeks where they had really literally nothing to eat except the potatoes they could dig out of the ground and the beehives they could find.
Huh? Okay.
And so that's just one example among many, I guess, in just a total breakdown of their logistical system. And Dr. Hoppe has a letter from this. I was just looking at it the other day, from the 2nd of September, where he's writing to his wife in Duisburg, I think she was, and he's just complaining. He's saying there's absolutely nothing here. This isn't like France. They always say in their letters, it was so much nicer in France, We had wine, we had food, and Hoppe is saying there's no fruit, there's no vegetables, there's no civilization, there's no nothing. And he's out of everything. So he provides this big, I wish I had the letter in front of me right now. He provides this big laundry list of things he wants. Send me paper clips, send me pens, send me shaving items, all this basic personal kit, not even his military kit, just basic personal things that he doesn't have. That's fairly typical, I imagine.
Yeah, that in that sense, I guess what we trying to define here is to what extent, like, you're absolutely right. They're often struck by this. You can't spend money in the East, right? There's nothing to buy. There are no shops. There's no personal equipment. Like, it's not like, in that sense, it's not like France. That reflects very much their cultural context. They come out of Central Europe and they've seen these other countries. That's definitely not where they are. And Hoppe, I think it's Ninth Army. He's going through a very poor part of the Soviet Union. There are richer parts of the Soviet Union. If you head up into the Baltic states, it's not as bad. But the difficulty to define is, like, what is, how hungry are these guys? Yeah, there's definitely moments, but real sort of starvation, certainly not swollen stomachs or anything like that. But that, I guess this is one of the things I find that's wonderful about the Eastern Front, especially perhaps in a forum like this where we've got many experts there. I always say to people say to me, "Oh, what's the next evolution?" And I say, look, we have the big picture, right? There's no question there's a big picture, but I think we've still got decades of research for people to do very targeted studies. Jeff Rutherford did a wonderful study of 3 units in Army Group Army Group North, and basically it's when you get down into this level that you start to realize, oh, there is no generic Eastern Front. There is the local Eastern Fronts, and they are very different wars. And that's one of the things that comes out time and again in his book is, what we thought was the big picture, that's not what's necessarily going on. And sometimes it is what's going on. But I think we've still got a long way to go to understand how topography, how local conditions on all kinds of levels, and also just who their local commanders are. I mean, some of the German commanders have a different engagement with this. Some of them are quiet, and this gets to be a big feature of the Eastern Front through 1942 and 43. Depending on who your local commander is, very much depends on how you can engage with that local population. Not because some commanders are really nice and lovely to the Soviet people. It's just because they're very pragmatic. Schmidt becomes one of these characters. There's a couple of others who basically recognize God damn it, we need these people. They're giving us intelligence, and they can give the Soviets and the partisans intelligence. If we keep raiding them and doing all these things, why are we surprised we're going to have real problems? We have to change our behavior in order to get workers, in order to get information, in order to have just a basic level of security. So let's share the food, and I think there's a lot of pragmatic considerations for them doing that. I mean, it's very much what I think a lot of armies that do occupation sometimes don't get to at the beginning, but get to after some period, that you need the people. And if you don't have them, that's a big problem. It's a problem operationally as well as just, anything to do with a moral accounting. But yeah, sorry.
Hey,
Hey,
folks, I'm sorry. I got to run. My wife just came in and said that we're having a crisis inside the house with one of our cats. So I got to go see what's going on. But David, really enjoyed it. And Rob, are you still there?
Yeah,
Or did
I'm here.
Rob have to go?
I'm here.
There. I'm assembling my maps for my Guderian book, and I want to talk to you about your atlas and see if you might have anything that would really help me out there. So I'll be in touch.
All righty. Yeah,
Okay, you guys all take care, and Jim, thanks for putting together another wonderful event.
Oh, thank you, Craig. Rob,
Okay,
you want to add
bye-bye.
to this?
Well, I've got to leave in a second, so I don't want to get it would be long and involved. So these are very good questions. I can write Dave, on a sidebar thing. So,
all right, Hal, go on, Hal.
Yeah, this relates to the last person's question about Mike's, I think, about the food. Have you ever encountered any orders, any documentary evidence linking the ground orders to the troops, go live off the land because we just don't have the logistics? Is there any link of that to the larger starvation plan?
you mean it sort of like divisional level or something like that? When you
No,
say,
I mean, is there anything coming from OKW or even Hitler's headquarters? Sure, order the troops to live off the land. That'll tie in with starving the 50 million Slavs. Is there anything, any documents, anything?
I wouldn't say categorically there aren't. There are some people who've done some wonderful work on German military occupation. So Theo Schulte has things on this, and Dieter Paul. And you have to understand, in German historiography, this is a completely different engagement. They almost don't do operations. In fact, to some people in...
You just want...
You muted, David. You have to unmute.
Are you hearing me?
Yeah, no,
That's very strange. I didn't touch anything, but computers are computers.
I blame it on Trump. Go on.
Yeah, there we go. So I would say you have to understand, in their world that there's a rich historiography. So I would say it's possible. People have done a lot of work. I'd have to actually look into that, whether there are documents. It fits that one fits the other, but I just don't know how explicit that connection is. But here's the thing: if they are concerned, if there was any realization this will have that result, there's certainly in the ethos of the time is not going to be any concern about that.
Right.
But I don't know that for a fact. The difference is in those books, they sometimes are very, very detailed and very, very rich, and they are asking exactly this question. It's one thing. It's maybe as a final point on this that is hard for Anglo-Americans to understand. It's one of the things I definitely learned. Sometimes people say, "Oh, it's good to be in Germany, right? Because archives are there and libraries are there." But sometimes it's cultural, right? You realize I at the German university had to defend doing this because operations to them felt beside the point. Right? Which none of us really see. Isn't that what we do? But from a German cultural context, if people wonder why, it's not just the classic thing of, oh, military history, we don't like military history or something. If you ask, what did German scholars do in the Third Reich? they did military history, and it was very the worst kind, right? You know, the fanfare and the, oh, aren't Germans the best in the world? So you can well imagine that the corrective after the Second World War is, well, military history is Nazi history, isn't it? So you can kind of understand that. It's a bit harder to defend that 80 years on, but that's the sort of the cultural legacy. And of course, then people will look at the worst of Anglo-American military history to say, God, some of this stuff is terrible. And yeah, it is. But there's also extremely good stuff. And the other point I would make, and the point that I was at pains to make, which is only 10, 15 years ago in Germany, was you guys all think that this is, you know, when you want to discover the world, the war of annihilation and the atrocities and the Holocaust and all the rest of it, that is somehow separate from a military campaign. But the reality is one informs the other. The same people doing this are running a war. And the worse the war gets, the more extreme those occupation policies get. So before you judge anybody, understand we're all on the same page. I'm not trying to divert attention away from that, but yeah, I think that there's a lot to be learned, and I think slowly Germans are coming, or academic Germans are coming across to that realization. But yeah, I don't have a straight answer. It would be interesting again to look more at the infantry files. Imagine how many there are, and I wouldn't be surprised if I started to get into Dieter Paul's book is the first one that comes to mind. But there are all kinds of books on occupation of every city. Pretty much has a history of its occupation. And it's remarkable what you find. The devil's in the detail, right?
Okay.
But yeah.
Thanks.
No worries.
Do other people have questions? I just want to add something to what you're saying, David.
Tim,
Brandon, yeah, hold on, Alex. Alex, hold on. Let me just finish my thought. What's interesting in what you just said about the reaction to operational history is, you know, you look at when the innovations of the Prussian General Staff actually hit the world. Many years ago, the military bookman, which no longer exists, he had a book that basically outlined every single staff study that had been done in the late 19th century that was influenced, of course, by the Prussian example. And I went and looked at some of them. We're talking about in Latin America, everywhere. And these military histories were the kind of thing that Delbruck would criticize. They were just purely operational histories, devoid of political, social, and economic context, period. And years later, I remember reading the official history of the Freikorps that was published during the Third Reich. I think some of the volumes were even done in the early stages of the Second World War. And of course, their political context was very different. So one can see the reaction to that, and this issue of Nazi history equals operational history still plagues us to this day. And to some extent, I blame some military historians for their absence of framing operational history in an interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary perspective, where you can do both while still retaining honesty and integrity to depict and explain to the average person operational detail. That, to me, has always been a big contradiction for the past 60 years as I've observed these battles go on. Alex, do you have other people raise their hands? Or Alex, you got a comment?
Brandon, yeah.
Oh, Brandon's here. Yes, go on, Brandon.
Okay. Real quick question, which is it kind of fits in with what was just said. Has anyone done a study comparing the experience of the average German soldier in the First World War invading Russia with the Second? And also, has anyone looked at it from comparing the two wars logistically on the East Front? Because it seems to me the Germans had a dry run here and kind of really missed a lot of big stuff.
Yeah, there is, I believe, a German book that I looked at a long time ago called Erster Weltkrieg, Zweiter Weltkrieg, which was basically a comparison, not just of the East, but just of Germany in that. It's remarkable how few of those kind of comparative studies there are. And one thing that for a very long time was the case, in fact, I looked at, after I'd done this book and I first started at the university I'm at, I actually tried to get funding to do a sort of an operational study of the Eastern Front in the First World War. I never got the money in the end, so I never ended up doing it. And I think that was actually probably a good thing in hindsight, because it's there's a real dearth of operational detail on the Eastern Front. In fact, the last 10 years have produced a couple of books, but if you go back 10 years, what did we have? Norman Stone from the 70s and a handful of books, right? And that's part of the reason why I was so fascinated by the Eastern Front for the First World War, because there was so little that seemed to be known about it. And I started to figure out that there was a good reason for that. That the files are just nowhere near as organized, and they're much more disparate. And it might have been a real nightmare if I'd had to get into that for all kinds of reasons. But yeah, the answer is I don't know of anything, especially related to the German soldiers. Not to say it's not out there, I'm just not aware of it. But I think there is a real, as I say, dearth of work. There's a lot of good stuff on the Second World War, like German soldiers' experience and so on. Less so, as far as I'm aware, on the German army in the East. But I think your point also hits on a really key thing that you would think, given that these two countries, well, yeah, Russian Federation and Imperial Germany and all the rest of it, sorry, not in Russian Federation, Imperial Russia, these are different countries in terms of their political direction and all the rest of it, but the same areas that they fight in. And that's, I think, a bit of a misnomer. You're right to point to it, because at one point, and this is anecdotally illustrated by, I remember a German soldier who wrote about an exchange with another guy, and he said, it's very curious. We should be doing so well in this campaign because we have all this motorization. We have trains, and we didn't always have that, especially if you look at, in that context, they were talking about Napoleon's army in 1812. And the guy only says, why do you think that's an advantage? And he says, because trains, because vehicles, don't you know how good they are? And he said, yeah, but don't you know how many problems they introduce to a modern military? Which I thought, wow, that's a really an incisive point to make. Because, yeah, a lot of advantages, but they also bring a lot of problems. It suddenly introduces, I mean, the one thing I think you can say, and I say this as someone who teaches a 4,500 years of military history course, militaries don't get better because of technology. Technology doesn't make war easier. Technology makes war infinitely more complicated. So there's a lot of advantages potentially, but modern militaries have to manage so much more. They have to combine so much more. There is just so, and if you do that very well, as you see the Americans in whatever Desert Storm or something, it's remarkable the one-sided nature of a military campaign. But as we perhaps see with Russia and Ukraine, the potential for that to go really wrong, or not to really understand, and parts don't all talk to each other, or doctrine doesn't speak to training, or technology doesn't speak to, is really high, really high. So, and I think that's part of the problem with Barbarossa. They kind of understand things to an extent, and maybe they should have done more studies on the war in the East. But the war in the East might have sent them, the war in the East in 1914 to 1917 would have set different problems as well. Those guys were really moving at the speed of marching men, and they are facilitated by a broken enemy. So they don't really understand how far they're going to get, how quickly they're going to have to get there, or how they're going to resource that. Anyway, over to Mark.
Yeah, thank you. My question is, I want to make sure I'm repeating what you had said correctly, but you had talked about the staff work, the German staff work up to June 22nd, having been good, or at least okay. But doesn't staff work include knowing things like the poor roads and the sand and the dust? And hey, yeah, we've got trucks from 15 different European nations, and we don't have the spare parts for these things, and they'll break down. And that, well, what if we don't capture all these railroad engines and railroad stock? And what happens if we don't do this? What happens if we don't destroy 80-90% of the Red Army within, what was it, 200 kilometers, 300 kilometers of the borders? You see where I'm going. It's
100%. Yep. No, you're absolutely right to ask that question, and I didn't explain that very well. So people often say to me, "Oh, this is all you being a historian. You're looking back 80 years. You're so critical of these German generals. You seem to know more. You think you know more. How do you know what you know?"
The staff work is very good, and I say that because it's being prepared, keep in mind, by lieutenants and captains and majors. They're the guys doing the work. That's why I can look at this and say, hang on a second. To give you an example on logistics, they are producing studies in 1940, 1941, so before Barbarossa, which say we can get about 300 kilometers before the hand baggage, as they call it. That's the term for this truck-based thing, before that all breaks down. After that, the diminishing returns are really, really high because the truck is carrying fuel, but it's going to have to consume its own load. And the further you keep going east, the more tens of kilometers you add, the less aggregate amount of some supplies get to the end. So it almost becomes not feasible. Now, if that's all written down for a guy like me, that's not me being, oh, the Germans made the wrong decisions. That's their own files. So my question becomes, the staff work is good, the staff work is in place, the staff work is pointing to a lot of problems. The embassy in Moscow, the German embassy, is conducting their own studies and they're sending back material. This is kind of very secondary stuff, but they're saying, hey, 40% of Soviet industrial production is now around the Urals and east of the Urals and east of Moscow, long way east of Moscow. That's 40%. So if you think this is going to end in the borders or even in the area, the AA line is this sort of mythical line that the Germans say, that's about the extent of where we would get in the Barbarossa campaign. Well, they're still going to have all this. So what's your solution? My problem is there is a disconnect between what all these pieces of paper that people like me can find and read, and then at the very top level, so the Wagner, the guy who's the head of the supply area, or Halder or Braukic, or even army group commanders who can see some of this stuff, they are seeing the black and white and they're going, yeah, but we'll do it anyway. Yeah, but we'll still be successful. Yeah, but we'll solve that as we go on. And I think what they think is, well, it'll all be resolved in these big border battles, and then pretty much everything will fall into place. Yeah, we might have the occasional problem. There's not really an understanding that the implications of you not having that, if the Soviet, as we know, with this fourth generation and the ability for the Soviets to fight on, but I mean, it should make sense. This country's got so much strategic depth. It's got a 200 million person population. The chances of you not winning at the border were quite high. I think that's also a reasonable assumption. You are assuming in every case a best case scenario. But even when they are confronted with, so what do you do? And logistics is probably the best one because they can categorically show them you'll get about 300 kilometers in and that's it. After that, you are going to have to extend those train lines. You are going to have to, but they still come up with best case scenario. Hey, how hard is it to convert train lines? It's super simple. Yeah, it's a wider gauge. You know what you do? It's super simple. You knock the rail, the what do they call those things? The pins. They probably got a more technical name. I don't know what it is. You knock it up, you push them together, you hammer them back down again, converted. The railroad troops get very little provision for motorization, for tools, for even just sheer manpower, because it's so simple. Now just extend it east. What they don't anticipate are two things, which are really dumb. Number one, how good the Soviets will be at scorched earth, destroying their own resources as they retreat. Number two, the Luftwaffe are bombing these things, and then as they get 200-300 kilometers in, they start realizing we have to rebuild the whole goddamn train line. Well, that's heavy construction. Now you're going to need sleepers. Now you're going to need rails. Now you're going to need, and the other things, basic things, like it's the stuff people don't think about, but if these distances are much greater in the Soviet Union, that's why they built bigger locomotives. That's why they built a wider gauge. They have bigger locomotives, right? That means that the infrastructure that supports rail in that time, turnstiles and water towers and coal and distribution stations, those things are built at greater distances. When they have to narrow them, they're using German and French trains, those things can't go as far without getting, oh, now we're going to have to build that heavy infrastructure. Secondary problems they didn't really plan for, but that compromises their ability to move. It's all these, when you get down into the weeds, oh, that's not such a small thing anymore. And sometimes in a lot of cases, the operational plans, at least for this initial invasion, is quite good. It's what the people do with it. And I'm very critical in this book, if anyone has read it, of people like Halder, because he's the guy who's in charge of all this information, and he should know it, because how do I know it? Because I'm reading the stuff he should have been reading. And I'm seeing it, and then what is he doing with it? Saying, yeah, it's a problem, but, we'll sort it out when we get in the campaign. Are you? How are you going to sort that out? For those things, there are no questions. It's the reason why I can be so critical of the generals, but not so critical. My initial supposition was, well, the Germans don't know this stuff because they just don't know. But
Then I'm reading all these pieces of paper telling me, no, there's going to be a real problem. What's the answer to some of these questions? It's the same thing you could say about Guderian. When you see all these figures about your declining panzer strength, the thing I'm always waiting for is one of his letters. It's never in his memoir, but something in the war diary saying Guderian's really upset. He's really concerned. He's sounding the alarm. Doesn't happen. I don't know the disconnect. It really speaks to some of these guys, it feels to me, are over promoted. They aren't able to conceive of this even in an operational, certainly not in a strategic context, to see the implications of what's going on. If this is what's happened in the first 4 weeks, and you're looking at where we've got at least as far to get east of Moscow again, where exactly are we ending? How are we going to repair these things? Where are the spare parts? You must have been in these meetings. So what's your conclusion? And are you sounding the alarm? Time and again, that's why I've looked at these panzer generals in this last book. No, none of them are. None of them seem to be even aware of it. It's shocking to me, but that's a consistent theme, it seems, of the German high command. Deeply problematic. Anyway.
Is it German? Is it German? Is it German arrogance, or they didn't want to go to Hitler and say, "Hey, we have a problem"?
For a long time, I used to think it was individuals. I used to be very critical in this book because Helder is so bad. Why is he not reacting to this? As I've done more work and spent more time on it, as I said, I spent this whole last book looking at 4 guys with their intimate private letters time and again, missing the point. Yes, at a lower level, but still missing the point. They seem to be unaware that the overextension that is the German army in their own part, they'll every time order in advance, and then they'll sit there and say, we've got no supplies and everyone's overstretched and what the hell's going on? Don't you see one equals the other? It's a difficult one for me to answer. The best I can do in answering it, and this is maybe time for another thing, I'll just give you a quick minute on this. I came up with this idea when I was writing the Battle of Moscow book. I realized that I had this problem. I had been explaining these problems by saying, well, the German army was overly optimistic. The German army wasn't able to see these things. I got to the point in the Battle of Moscow book where I thought, this doesn't cut up for me anymore, and I can't really explain to my audience in the way I can't explain to you guys what is going on here. I don't understand anymore. And I started to come up with this idea of, is it possible, and you think what you will with this, but is it possible we could talk about something called National Socialist military thinking? And what does that mean? This is a revolutionary movement that abrogates law, abrogates religion, abrogates morality. We know that's National Socialism, right? This is a National Socialist army on a lot of levels. Is it possible when you've abrogated all those things, because all these commanders, they're seeing what's happening. They know the Holocaust is going on in real time. It's right behind the panzer groups. They're shooting them at the very front. Where do they get their ammunition from? Not their SS supply chain, from the army. Where are they getting the vehicles from and all this kind of stuff? They get the fuel from the panzer groups. They know what's going on. None of these guys have a problem. Not just Guderian and all the rest. None of them. Not the army commanders, not the corps commanders. There are 44 corps. How many divisional commanders? 150 divisional commanders resign in disgust at what this... None. So this is a National Socialist army in a way you would not have seen with the Americans or probably not even the Soviets. Who knows? I don't know about the Soviets. But not with the Australians, not with the British. I think that's a fairly clear distinction. Something's different there. And if they've abrogated all those other things, to what extent have they abrogated Clausewitz? In that sense, they're no longer just military men. These guys are, what does Hitler always say in those speeches? The primacy of will. Show me a man. Don't you sit there and tell me about, I can't do it, I got no fuel, I got no... Show me the man who's going to stand up for the moment and do this. And that's what German propaganda celebrates. These guys who, 15 guys in a vehicle gone off and captured a bridge, and this forward thinking and dynamic, and that's the ethos of the times. So no one wants to be, as Muller used to say to me, no one wants to be the guy who puts their hands up and says, Mein Führer, das ist nicht möglich. That's not going to be possible. You look like a weakling. You look like the guy, the cannot guy. I want the can-do guy in here. And that's the ethos of the time. But that also then means that these very pragmatic conversations that we all see and think are obvious, isn't that rational? Aren't we all products of the Enlightenment that, highlights rationalism? That's what they're in the process of undoing. They're revolutionary. We'll just make a new world. Except that doesn't work for horses. It doesn't work for fuel. It doesn't work for ammunition. And that's part of the problem, which is why, fast forward 3 years in 1944, why is Army Group Center being told, I don't care how many deficiencies you've got, just have the men have the primacy of will. yeah, that doesn't mean anything to us, but it kind of does to them. It's not us having to make sense of our world through our eyes. It's us having to make sense of their world through their eyes. And maybe the difference is stop thinking rationally, everybody. We have to think irrationally. That's not an answer, but maybe it is an answer.
No, absolutely brilliant.
Thank you. Thank you.
It raises the question of is it a Nietzschean military theory? Go on, Ted.
Yeah, no, I was going to think this is extraordinary. This is exactly where I was going. I'm very glad you jumped into that area because I come to agree with that. It's a major possibility. But it's also we were talking about this whole thing, the temporal trap that they've set themselves. The war has to be ended in a certain amount of time because that's what it has to be ended in. They've committed themselves to an impossible objective on a rational basis, but they've assumed, as you said, they've scripted the enemy. They've assumed that the enemy will collapse. If the enemy doesn't collapse, what happens? Well, if you ask that question, then you have to write off the whole operation. Now they did this before. They did this when I looked at France. Hitler, in that case, was right. He said, I want something better than that, than World War I again. I mean, I'm again not giving him credit for that. He himself claimed it. What they did in Scandinavia was possible. They did things which were impossible to do, and they accumulated them. So, well, maybe we just roll dice one more time. I as a student of the Japanese military, that's where I come down on many things. So Tojo's conclusion about the beginning of the war was, well, you just have to leap off the Kiyomizu temple. You trust fate. Fate will solve the problem. So there's something deep in that, but it's a temporal problem. I think that's where we really have to look at that planning. What do they think is going to happen a year out? And as you pointed out just a few minutes ago, David, really, very well, that they've been looking at the whole thing through the eyes of National Socialism and changing the world. And what they plan to do with the East is so ridiculous, so impossible, so massively inhumane that there's something else at work. And I'm not just talking about killing all the people. They're in the middle of Ukraine. They were allies at the end of the First World War. They were working together. The lessons that might have come from 1917 and 1918 were not wanted. That's why I thought when you looked at the very beginning, the very first map you showed, if you just give me 1 second more, with the first map you showed, the whole operation was charging into the eastern Poland. What had been Polish territory. The Russians moved forward, and they're in a different land at that time. So it makes a very, very interesting concept that people aren't looking at the full structure of either side. And of course, the idea that Stalin could be surprised in this war is, of course, equally incomprehensible. So thank you very much.
No, I'm glad you said that actually, because I have tried to explain my idea of National Socialist military thinking more than once. Sometimes people don't know what I'm talking about, so it's good that landed.
Very, very interesting. Yeah,
Go on, Ralph.
Thank you. You of course have changed our thinking and most people's thinking about what was happening in the summer of 41 with these kinds of problems popping up right from the beginning of the campaign. So my question is sort of the obverse, considering all these problems that the Germans had from the outset. And then they started suffering reversals with, being thrown back from Moscow and later on. How is it that they held on so long? How is it that it took so long for them to be defeated? What do you think?
We got 4 hours.
I mean, yeah, you're right. I mean, one of the things I often think is, and this is where we perhaps see the inverse of everything we've talked about today. And again, I'm not to get ahead of myself, but offensive operations are much harder than defensive operations, especially if you have a poor army, right? So the Soviet army isn't poor necessarily in the summer of 41. That's a professional army, but it's being destroyed very, very quickly, right? Those forces are being encircled and attrition and all the rest of it. So when you get to the winter of 41, 42, what you have is you still have a very good German army, very experienced. Now they're fighting on the defensive, and the Soviets are having to go on the offensive with men who aren't particularly well trained, who don't have heavy equipment. And yeah, I know the mantra for that period is often, well, the Soviets are doing well because they're the ones now doing that classical military thing of taking ground, but they're doing it at horrendous cost. And they're not encircling German forces, they're just butting up against them and pushing them back. That becomes the Soviet ethos. So it's not that the Germans are terrible or that the Soviets have yet developed that operational ability to really devastate the Germans, devastate them in a way that we will start to see 3 years in, Bagration and so on, when Army Group Center gets destroyed. But if you think about that, and if the question is, how do the Germans hang on? The Germans hang on because it's very hard to attack. They have got strategic depth and they are tactically very good at what they do. Horrendous casualties in the winter of 41, 42. Right through, what did I say before very quickly when I was talking about Stalingrad? There are these other battles that are taking place in the north around Brezhnev. That's because the Soviets are now doing what they had also done for the Germans, very poor defensive operations that facilitate German advances in 41. They have very poor offensive operations that facilitate German defense. That's not to say the Germans aren't under a lot of pressure, but I think the Germans are able to survive in no small part because at that middle level and at that lower level, it takes an extremely long time for the Soviets to learn, and not because Russians aren't smart at learning things. It's because if you constantly have high attrition, well, the next guy gets in there, he's got to learn all this stuff from the ground up. And if he's being told, well, you'll attack on this day and be at this point, and it's the Soviet military, you end up going before you're ready and not learning at the level that you can learn at. And I think that is a real problem for them. It doesn't mean that they don't get better. And as they get more and more resources, these things become more and more capable. And at the same time, there's a very slow decline in German capability, and they're constantly being stretched as they're having to pull more forces out, certainly by 44 to go to the west. They're not getting as many tanks. They're not the priority anymore. I think you can sort of see this. One of the things I notice about the Eastern Front, it's very hard there's not that one thing. People who reduce it to, there's one point, here's the point. No, it's a whole confluence of many factors feeding in over a longer period of time that I think often explains the bigger trends. And maybe what I said before as well, we need more targeted studies. People who write on this area, write a book on the 1941 or Barbarossa or Stalingrad. I think what we need is more with that Jeff Rutherford guy, people who can give us these refined studies. That's the thing that's missing. We need more detail. I know that sounds crazy to people, especially, of course, I would say that as the guy who wrote 5 books over 1941, but I like detail. In any case, thanks.
All right, Alex, go on.
Yeah, so two related issues questions. On the production battle behind all of this, one of which is do the documents, do they show an understanding of what Lend-Lease is doing to fill gaps for the Soviets? And two, when do they realize, holy shit, the Russians have dismantled entire factories and moved them east? And when these get back online in the Urals, they're we're going to have a problem. Sure. Thank you.
Yeah. So there's something called the First Protocol, which is the Lend-Lease Agreement. And that, I can't remember, I think it's the 1st of October, or don't quote me on that. It's around about then that takes effect. So a couple of days after Barbarossa, Roosevelt does extend Lend-Lease to the Soviet Union, right? So it exists as an idea, but the actual mechanics of how will this work and what will be supplied, that's going to be organized around these protocols, which is going to take time. In the first protocol, it's not American equipment. I know America is the country that provides Lend-Lease, but it's just not there in anything like the numbers in 1941 that we might imagine. So the first protocol is overwhelmingly dominated by Lend-Lease supplies, but it's British. It's British material. You're absolutely right to ask that. I'd be quite fascinated when I got into the later books, looking in the later months of the year, where and when, and I kept an eagle eye out for it. Are we going to see anything to do with Lend-Lease? It starts to appear. The first references are late October, where they're just a reference. I think that's a British plane. or I think there might even be the odd American plane at that point. But it's definitely November. November is when you start to see multiple references and and even explicit proof that they are now coming across, and that comes up again in December. They are coming across British tanks and aware that there are British, I think it's Hurricanes that are as part of the Soviet arsenal. Alexander Hill's done quite a bit of work on this, looking at this stuff, and I think his figures, I'm doing this from memory, it's from articles from about 15, 20 years ago. In the Battle of Moscow, I can't remember the figure, so don't quote me on it, but it's I think 20% of Soviet tanks are British-made tanks. Interestingly enough, the Soviets don't rate these tanks at all. They think this is a bit rubbish, and they don't think that this could be the real British tanks, like the ones that they would really use normally. This must be some hybrid special tank that they would normally send to North Africa because the tracks are so narrow, it's so under-armored. Maybe that's what you need for Africa, because they keep referring to them as Africa tanks, right? Because this isn't because they're building much heavier models. Could this be the heaviest that the Soviets have? It's the same way the Germans, right? They don't have as heavier models. So they're not as good operationally. The Germans are, though, shocked by this. They are definitely surprised that this stuff is there. But I don't think, again, that they miss the strategic context. They don't really join the dots that, wow, these supply lines are in effect, and what might this mean into the future, which by then should have been very apparent to them. We're not going to end this war anytime soon. Sorry, Alex, there was a second part to your question. One was Lend-Lease and the other? Are you muted?
The disassembly and reassembly of entire factories. And
yes.
Did they realize, or when did they realize that, hey, that's going to be a problem? That the ability of the Soviets to reconstitute their production further east, what that means for the war.
That's a very good question in the sense that I have, at the top of my head, I cannot remember a single reference anywhere in any of the military files to that phenomena. I can't remember even reading at the higher level. Nothing comes to mind over to the team, but in Halder's diary, or people who might have been receiving that level of intelligence to respond to the fact. At the same time, I would also put that in a category of there are some things that the Soviet Union does that we know they do because we have that information, that if you said to me that's a thing a country's going to do, it's still, even having read studies of it, I still struggle with that one. Like, how exactly is that possible? Especially in context of a war, a full-scale war where you were trying to shift men to the front and move them and all the rest of it. If someone said, move, 50% of your industrial capacity hundreds of kilometers, restart them. In fact, one of the best pieces of analysis I've ever read on that, which was another historian reacting to that same idea. How the hell is that possible? We can't move 50% of American production in a couple of months and just restart it and keep going. That's not possible. But this person who was reacting to this said, yes, you would say that only because you don't have the Soviet experience. When you had these 5-year plans, there were no factories. People were just told, greenfield site, go there, build it. So where does the electricity capacity come from? Build it. And it's Stalinist Russia. So they had the experience of multiple, there's multiple, so they're in the third 5-year plan by the time Barbarossa comes. So this idea, which would to any normal country be, that's just not possible. No, that is possible because they've been through it, and a few heads have been, chopped because they don't meet their production quotas. In other words, it's a uniquely qualified country to do something that extraordinary. And look, we should be careful of the Soviet propaganda. Not all of these sites work out. Some of them are disasters, right? But yeah, it's overwhelmingly still possible. They still seem to achieve it. And it's a remarkable story. It's also on the Soviet side, but I can't think of too much in German intelligence to say they even knew it was going on, certainly not to the extent that it does. But then am I surprised that if there is that understanding and that recognition, that the Germans don't react to it? That wouldn't surprise me at all.
Right. Let me bring Mike in as the last comment question. And when we were just talking about this, it reminded me of an incident in 1987 when Steve Zaloga and I were at the conference that Colonel Glantz organized in Garmisch-Partenkirchen. And Steve produced a document that was created by German intelligence before Operation Barbarossa, outlining the T-34 tank. And the German officers at the conference, which were all junior officers, they were overwhelmingly selected from panzer divisions. They had never seen anything like that. And when you brought this up, Alex, with your question, it reminded me of they were sitting there taking that document, passing around among themselves for the several days we were in Garmisch, because they were just flabbergasted by that revelation that there was actually a little speck of an intelligence gleaning that the T-34 was coming online.
Jim, I'd never heard that before. My impression was that they had discovered the T-34. Well, I'm sure a lot of the guys did discover the T-34 in real time when they encountered them on the Eastern Front, but I had never heard that there was anything circulated in Germany prior to that suggested, no, there really is this. But isn't that just part of our theme? That's really fascinating. It absolutely fits with that cultural. Even if they got this, you might have a moment of pause and say, my God, how good are our, if this is a real concept, how good are our anti-tank guns? Our 3.7, centimeter or even the 5 centimeter French guns that we took won't do much against this. That's a problem. And it turns out that the Soviets had, what was it? I can't remember off the top of my head. Glance has got a figure, 800 of these things? 1,500?
Yes,
something
800 KV-1s and T-34s.
T-34s?
It was like a needle in the haystack that Steve had discovered, and it sort of blew everybody's mind. But Michael, why don't we, because, first of all, thank you so much for being so generous with your time. We could keep you here for hours, and I know that a lot of us have to do things tomorrow.
You guys got to get to bed at some point.
Yes. Well, you got the crew that'll definitely want to keep you up and ask you questions indefinitely. But Michael, why don't we just have this as the last question? And Michael, go on, please.
Yeah, I have a question, which kind of, and I was wondering how it tied into the idea of a ideological Nazi ideological operational type of thinking. And it has to do with casualty figures. I know in the West, at least from 1940, from 43 to the end of the war, the German forces in both land, sea, and air had a tendency to underreport casualties until obviously a unit was, predominantly wiped out. But they would underreport casualties, even though that might be counterintuitive in the fact that they would not be getting enough reinforcements. But and actually, if you're talking about Nazi ideology, then that would make sense. To what degree in the East did you see that happening? Now, I know that obviously when an entire army surrenders, there's no hiding it. But during the actual, while a unit was operating, did you see, and to what degree did you see any underreporting on the Germans' part, underreporting of casualties?
Right.
And how that might tie into the Nazi ideology.
My feeling is, like, when I was very interested in numbers, we measure war often through numbers because we need some kind of, for want of another term, scorecard. So I was always very interested in numbers. I would see a lot of disparity at one point in trying to account for an individual panzer division's losses. I looked at supply diaries, I looked at the 1R, the operations diary, and I had some other source. I can't remember what it all was. But what I found was within the same basic time, multiple different figures for this panzer division's numbers. There was no real accounting for why, but they clearly had different numbers. I have never seen anybody writing anything about, oh, don't report those numbers, or substitute that for this, or oh, we'll have to be careful if we present that. It feels to me as though there was because of the absence of that, there's multiple reasons why we might end up with different numbers, simply because not everyone's always in control of the same information, but nothing that is a top-down directive that cooks the books or transforms the numbers. There's not a cultural problem with reporting that. And in some ways, it speaks to that same theme. It's reporting it's I think there's a lot of honesty at that lower level. When I say lower, it's not that low, division and certainly at regimental and so on, but at divisional and core level, they're doing the opposite. They are brutally honest. In fact, what I think, if they're faking anything, is they're making it worse than it is because they are so very worried in this impoverished front about getting resources that they want to make the biggest pitch they possibly can. And they do that by emphasizing how bad things are. Walter Neering, he's the commander, I think, oh God, of the 17th Panzer Division. I'm doing this from memory. He has a passage which I've never forgotten. Oh God, I think I did write it down here. Yes, I did. Oh God, it's right there for me. He's the commander, sorry, of the 18th Panzer Division, and he warns, this is a direct quote. He's talking about all the problems, and then he makes this statement. This situation and its consequences will become unbearable in the future if we do not want to be destroyed by winning. That's from early July 1941. Why do they make this very extreme case? Because the whole Eastern Front is impoverished. They look for resources anywhere they can get them, and they need to make the case we are poorly off. And I think the part of the problem is, as we've talked about before, the upper levels aren't necessarily responding to the gravity of the problem. And that's making the desire for these guys to be heard all the greater. So they're not just not reporting it, they absolutely are reporting it. Yeah, so I've never read anything to say the opposite. And I think that there's they're not even having to exaggerate. The numbers are very much there. There are real problems at this. Certainly when you get much deeper into the war, those problems become even more pronounced. So yeah, that's the best I can do to answer that. And let's be honest, no matter how much they complain, let's be honest, most of the time they're not going to get what they're asking for. The other thing I'd just say as a final point on that, there is something called black supplies. They constantly are capturing things. What they tend not to do where they do cook the books is report that stuff because it's not part of an inventory. No one can trace that they got it just because they've captured fuel or captured, T-34. They don't necessarily want to report it because someone will take it off them potentially, and we can just keep that in their so-called black supplies. That's what we can live off, and it's up to the command to keep giving us stuff. If we say, oh, we just captured stuff, they'll say, oh, well, less priority. Which is also a bit of a problem. It's also a bit of a problem from an economic planning point of view because they are asking people to report this stuff and then they're not doing it.
Amazing. Could I share the screen again, David?
Go ahead. Oh, I'll stop sharing mine.
Well, I want to thank everybody for coming here tonight. Thank you, David, so much for being so generous with your time today. Yes. It was really terrific. A great pleasure to have you come and talk with us. All of us enjoyed it immensely, and we look forward to seeing you again in the near future. Thank you so much, David.
Thank you. Thank you all. I would just say as a final point, thank you. It's wonderful to get the chance to indulge a topic that you do love, and perhaps in more detail than I might at undergraduate lectures or a Rotary Club or wherever I end up, where is the Soviet Union again? Here's the map. It's lovely to have an audience that appreciates a bit more detail. As I say, I did all these slides especially because I kind of thought, well, this is the chance to indulge. So thank you all for being such avid listeners.